Tonight, picture a low green island off the northeast coast of Britain, a place so flat and so quiet that the sea seems to lie down beside it rather than break against it. It is early summer in the year 793. The tide has gone far out across the sands, and the causeway that joins the island to the mainland is a wet gray road going nowhere, shining under a sky the color of milk. There is a monastery here, a low huddle of timber and stone with a small church at its heart, and inside that church there are candles burning in the middle of the afternoon because the walls are thick and the windows are narrow and the monks like the light to be gentle. Out on the shore the seabirds are arguing over nothing at all, as seabirds do. A brother in an undyed woolen robe walks the tide line with his hood down, looking for driftwood, and stops and stands and shades his eyes, because far out where the gray water meets the gray sky there are shapes that were not there an hour ago. They are long and they are low and they lie on the water the way a knife lies on a table. Their sails are square and striped, and they are coming in on the flood tide with the wind behind them, and they are moving faster than anything the brother has ever seen move on water. He does not know what they are. He has no word for them yet. In a few years, everyone in Britain will have a word for them, and the word will be enough on its own to make a village pack its cattle and go inland. But tonight we're going to begin long before that afternoon, and we're going to go on long after it. Because the story of the Vikings in Britain is not really a story about 3 ships on a summer tide. It is a story about 300 years, about farmers and raiders and kings and traders and slaves and settlers, about a country that was invaded and then, slowly and strangely, absorbed the invaders until nobody could quite say where one people ended and the other began. It is a story that ends with half the map of northern England speaking a language the monks would not have recognized, and with words in your own mouth, tonight, that were carried here in the bottom of a boat. So settle now into whatever stillness you have made for yourself. Let the pillow take the whole weight of your head, all of it, not half of it. Let the lamp grow dim, or let it go out altogether, and let the small weight of the day slip down from your shoulders 1 quiet inch at a time. There is nothing left in this day that requires you. Everything in this story has already happened, every ship has already landed, every king has already reigned and been buried. Every argument has already been settled by people who are long past caring how it turned out. You are entirely safe here. If you enjoy what I do on this channel, you might like the video or subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and only in the morning, because it is not worth waking up for. And if you are lying awake somewhere in the world tonight, leave your location and your local time down in the comments, because it helps other sleepless people find their way here. And there is a peculiar comfort in scrolling through those comments and seeing how many strangers are awake with you. Now, breathe out slowly and let us begin 1 layer before the beginning. Before there were Vikings in Britain, there was no Britain. At least not in the sense you might imagine. There was an island, and the island was full of kingdoms, and the kingdoms spent most of their energy on each other. In the north, beyond the old Roman wall, there were the kingdoms of the Picts and the Scots, speaking languages of their own and quarreling in the long glens. In the west there were the British kingdoms, in the mountains of Wales and in Cornwall, the descendants of the people who had been here before the legions came, pushed westward but never conquered, keeping their own poetry and their own church. And across the wide, fertile middle and east of the island there were the English kingdoms, the Anglo-Saxons, whose ancestors had crossed the North Sea in small boats 3 centuries earlier and settled the river valleys and the chalk downs, and had by now entirely forgotten that they were newcomers. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the quiet joke that runs underneath this whole story. The people who would be raided by seaborne Germanic-speaking pagans in the 8th century were themselves the descendants of seaborne Germanic-speaking pagans from the 5th century. The monks who wrote in horror about strangers arriving from across the water were writing in a language that had itself arrived from across the water. And in some cases, their grandfathers' grandfathers had made the crossing in ships not so very different in shape. History has a way of arranging these things and then saying nothing about it. There were 4 English kingdoms that mattered most by the late 8th century, and it is worth learning their shapes now, gently, because they will each be knocked down in turn. And you will want to know what is falling. In the north, stretching from the River Humber up to the Firth of Forth, lay Northumbria, a kingdom that had been the most brilliant in Britain a century before. Northumbria had produced scholars whose books were copied all over Europe and monasteries whose libraries were the envy of Frankish bishops, and a style of manuscript painting so intricate that later people assumed angels must have helped. It had also, by 790, spent about 80 years murdering its own kings with a regularity that would be comic if it were not so exhausting. Kings of Northumbria were deposed, blinded, exiled, recalled, and murdered again, sometimes by their own household, and the kingdom's strength had leaked away through all those small internal wounds. In the middle of the island lay Mercia, the great flat kingdom of the Midlands, whose name simply means the borderers, the March people. Mercia in the late 8th century was ruled by a king called Offa, who was the nearest thing Britain had to an emperor. He built a wall of earth along the Welsh border that is still there, a long green ripple across the fields, and he minted coins with his own face on them. And he corresponded with Charlemagne on the continent as one great man to another, which Charlemagne tolerated with only mild condescension. Mercian power was real and heavy, and it pressed on everyone else. Then in the southeast there was Kent, small and rich and old, with the Archbishop's Church at Canterbury, and in the east there was East Anglia, flat and watery and wealthy in wool and fish. And in the southwest, running along the chalk and the moor from the Thames to the edge of Cornwall, there was Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons. Wessex in 790 was not yet the most important kingdom in Britain. It was a large, well-formed, moderately quarrelsome place that had been under Mercian influence for a generation and did not much like it. Nobody looking at the map at that moment would have picked Wessex as the kingdom that would still be standing when all the others had fallen. But that is what happened, and the reason it happened is a great deal of the middle of this story. Now, the thing that made Britain so attractive to a raider was not its kings, it was its churches. Christianity had come to the English kingdoms in the 6th and 7th centuries, and it had come with enormous enthusiasm, and enthusiasm in that age was expressed in gold. A rich man who wanted to be remembered kindly founded a monastery. He gave it land, and the land gave it rent. And the rent bought silver, and the silver was beaten into chalices and patens and reliquaries and the covers of gospel books, and the gospel books themselves were bound in ivory and studded with garnets and gold wire. A single altar in a modest English monastery might hold more portable wealth than an entire village would see in a century. And these monasteries were, by design, in lonely places. The whole point of a monastery was withdrawal. You founded it on an island, or on a headland, or up a quiet river valley, precisely so that the noise of the world would not reach it. Nobody built walls around them, because there had been no need. The English kingdoms fought each other with armies that marched overland, and an army that marched overland could be seen coming for a day or more, and in any case, a Christian king making war on another Christian king generally did not sack the churches, because he wanted the local bishop's blessing afterwards. So the monasteries sat undefended and unwalled and full of treasure on the very edge of the sea for 200 years. From the point of view of anyone arriving by water, they were not fortresses. They were shelves. Now let us cross the water, because to understand what happened to Britain, we have to understand the people who were about to arrive. And they were not what the monks said they were. The monks said they were demons out of the north, a punishment sent by God, faceless and countless. They were in fact farmers. The lands we now call Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were, in the 8th century, a scatter of small territories with no unified kingdom among them, ruled by local chieftains and petty kings whose authority reached about as far as they could personally ride in a morning. The great majority of the people who lived there spent their lives doing what most people everywhere did in that age. They kept cattle and sheep and pigs. They grew barley and oats and a little rye where the soil allowed it. They cut hay in the short, bright summer and spent the rest of the year worrying about whether they had cut enough. They fished and they hunted and they made iron out of the brown bog ore that could be dug from the marshes, and they were extraordinarily good at working wood. Their houses were long and low, framed in timber, roofed in turf or thatch, with a single long hearth burning down the middle of the main room, and the smoke finding its own way out through a hole above. The whole household slept in that one room on benches built along the walls, wrapped in wool and skins, with the animals often stalled at the far end for their warmth. Imagine, for a moment, lying on such a bench in the deep of a northern winter. The fire has been banked down to a red heart. The turf roof is a foot thick, and it holds the heat like a hand cupped around a flame. Outside there is a wind coming off a fjord with nothing between it and the ice, and inside there is the smell of wood smoke and wet wool and cattle and barley porridge, and the sound of about 14 people breathing. That is where the Viking age came from, not from a war camp, from a warm, dark room full of sleeping farmers. What those farmers had that nobody else in Europe had was the ship. This is the single most important fact in the whole story, and it deserves a slow unfolding. Scandinavians had been building boats for thousands of years. But somewhere in the 7th and 8th centuries, they solved a set of problems that other shipbuilders had not solved. And the solutions came together into one design of astonishing quality. The hull was clinker built, which means the planks were not butted edge to edge, but overlapped like the boards of a fence, each riveted to the one below with iron nails. That overlapping made the shell of the ship immensely strong for its weight, and it made it flexible, so that instead of fighting a heavy sea, the hull could work and twist a little with it, the way a living thing does. The planks themselves were not sawn but split radially out of a single tall oak following the grain, so that every board kept the wood's natural strength and shed water rather than soaking it. The keel was one long piece, curved, so the boat sat in the water like a shallow dish rather than a deep box, and then, quite late, they added the sail. There is a genuine mystery about why it took Northern Europe so long to put a mast into these hulls, since the Mediterranean had been sailing for millennia, but once the Scandinavians did it, the effect was total. A big square woolen sail, woven and greased against the weather, on a mast set in a heavy oak block on the keel. With that sail, a ship could cross open water. Without it, a crew was condemned to row, and rowing across the North Sea is not a plan, it is a punishment. And here is the detail that decided the fate of Britain. Because the hull was so shallow, drawing perhaps 3 feet of water fully loaded, the ship did not need a harbor. It did not need a quay or a pilot or a deep channel. It could sail across 200 miles of open sea and then, at the far end, run straight up onto an ordinary beach, and the crew could step out into ankle-deep water. It could also go the other way and sail up a river, far up, past the tidal reach, and into the soft green middle of a country that had always assumed the sea was somewhere else. A ship like that turns every stretch of coast and every navigable river into a road, and it puts the man who owns the ship at the front of that road, and it means that the wealthy, undefended monastery on the lonely headland is no longer remote at all. It is, in fact, extremely conveniently located. So why did they come? The old answer was overpopulation, and there is probably something in it. Because inheritance customs in much of Scandinavia divided a farm among sons, and there is a limit to how many times you can divide a hillside before the pieces stop feeding anybody. A younger son with no land and a share in a boat has an obvious problem and an obvious solution. There was also politics. Across the 8th and 9th centuries, local chieftains were consolidating power, squeezing out rivals, and a man who lost a power struggle at home had to go somewhere, and preferred to go somewhere he could come back rich. There was trade, which mattered more than the raiding stories admit. Scandinavians were merchants long before they were raiders in the English record, running furs and walrus ivory and amber and iron and slaves down the rivers of the East all the way to the silver of the Islamic world, and they had learned exactly how much silver existed in the world and exactly how badly they wanted some of it. And there was the plain fact that Christian Europe had by then concentrated a great deal of loose, portable wealth into buildings with no defenses and no soldiers, and had done so entirely openly, and had told everyone about it, and there was no reason on earth why a pagan farmer with a fast ship and a hard year behind him should have regarded that arrangement as permanent. And there was one more thing, which is harder to measure, but which the sagas insist on, and that is the value that society placed on reputation. A man was, in a very real sense, what people said about him after he left the room. Wealth was not for hoarding, it was for giving away in front of witnesses, because a chieftain who gave arm rings and swords and fine cloth to his followers bound them to him, and grew in name. And a man with a great name attracted more followers, who required more gifts, which required more silver. It was an engine that could not idle. Once it started turning, it needed fuel every single year, and the fuel came from over the sea. Their gods were not the gods of a peaceful mind. They kept a great many, and the ones we remember best are Odin, the restless one-eyed god of poetry and war and cunning, who hanged himself on a windswept tree for 9 nights to win the secret of the runes, and Thor, the red-bearded thunderer with the hammer, who was in truth the more popular of the two among ordinary people because he protected farms and sanctified marriages and was reassuringly straightforward. Thor was the god you wore around your neck. Odin was the god you approached carefully and did not entirely trust, which was a sensible attitude. Since he was famous for granting victory to a favorite for many years and then, at the last battle, and for no reason anyone could explain, withdrawing it. They believed the world had been made out of the body of a giant and would end in a great battle in which the gods themselves would die, and they seemed to have found that idea not depressing, but clarifying. If even the gods are doomed, then the only question left is how you behave in the meantime. They buried their dead with the things they had used, and sometimes with a boat, and sometimes with a horse, and in a very few horrifying cases with a slave, and they left no doctrine and no scripture, only poetry, which is why so much of what we know about their beliefs was written down 2 or 3 centuries later by Christian Icelanders who were doing their best to be fair to their great grandparents. So that is the world the ships came from, not a horde. A network of farms and small halls bound by kinship and gift-giving and reputation, sitting at the top of Europe with the single best piece of maritime technology on Earth at exactly the moment when the richest and softest targets in the known world were sitting unwalled on the beaches to their west. It would have taken a truly remarkable degree of restraint for nothing to have happened. And in the last years of the 8th century, something happened. There is a very small and easily overlooked entry in the English records some 4 or 5 years before the famous one, and it is almost more revealing than the disaster that followed. 3 ships put in on the south coast near Portland in Dorset in the Kingdom of Wessex. The King's Reeve, which is to say the local official responsible for royal business and for taxing merchants, rode down to the beach with a small party to meet them. He did not go armed for battle. He went in the ordinary way of his job, because ships came in and ships were dealt with, and someone had to write down what they were carrying. He seems to have assumed they were traders, and he intended to bring them to the king's town so the proper duties could be paid. What happened next is recorded in a single, flat sentence. They killed him, and that, more than anything else, tells you what the coming century was going to feel like, because it is the sound of an entire assumption breaking. For generations, a strained sail meant business. Afterwards, a strained sail meant something else, and everybody on every coast in Britain had to learn it one beach at a time. Before we go back to that island and that tide, let us stay a while in the world that was about to be interrupted, because it was a beautiful world and it deserves a slow look, and because nothing is better for sleep than a description of other people's routines. A monastery in 8th century Northumbria was not a silent gray building full of hooded strangers. It was a working estate, a school, a library, a farm, a guest house, a hospital, and a workshop, all held together by a timetable. The timetable was the point. The whole day was divided by prayer, beginning in the darkness long before dawn and ending in the early dark of evening, and between the offices there was work, and the work was mostly ordinary. Brothers plowed and reaped and tended bees, because wax was needed for candles and honey was the only sweetness anyone had. They kept sheep, because wool was clothing and parchment came from the skins of calves and lambs. They brewed ale, because water could not be trusted, and everyone, including the monks, drank ale in quantities that would alarm a modern doctor. They cooked, they mended, they dug, and they buried the local dead, and they took in travelers, and they took in the sick, and they took in the occasional nobleman's difficult younger son who had been given to God because he could not be given land. And in one room, generally the best lit room in the whole settlement, a small number of them made books. The scriptorium is where the wealth was, in every sense. To make a single great gospel book, you first needed a herd. The finest surviving Northumbrian manuscripts required the skins of well over 100 calves, and each skin had to be soaked in lime, scraped with a curved knife, stretched on a frame, dried, scraped again, and rubbed with pumice and chalk until it was smooth and pale and even. Then the sheets were folded and cut and pricked and ruled, and only then could a man sit down with a quill cut from a goose feather and begin. The inks were made from oak galls and iron, from soot, from crushed minerals, and the colors came from wherever color could be found, including, in the case of one famous blue, a stone that had to be carried overland from the mountains of Central Asia, which tells you something about how far these quiet islands were connected into the world. The work was slow, beyond modern patience. A scribe might manage 2 or 3 pages in a good day, and a page of pure ornament, one of those great carpet pages where the whole surface dissolves into interlaced birds and beasts and knotwork so fine that the lines run at a density modern eyes need a lens to follow, could take weeks. There is a page in one Northumbrian gospel book with more than 10,000 separate red dots laid down around the letters, each placed by hand by a man sitting on a wooden stool in the north of England with the sea wind pushing at the shutters. He did it because he believed the book was the Word of God and therefore deserved every hour he had. The island itself, the one in our opening, was called Lindisfarne, and it had been a holy place for well over a century by 793. It is a tidal island, which means it is not always an island. Twice a day the sea withdraws and lays bare a broad, flat causeway of sand and mud, and for a few hours you can walk to the mainland. And then the water comes back over that causeway quietly and quickly from both ends at once, and you cannot. The monks of Lindisfarne lived by that rhythm as much as by the bell. The island's most famous inhabitant had been a monk called Cuthbert, who had died more than 100 years before our story begins, and who had been by all accounts a genuinely gentle man. A shepherd's boy who became a monk and then a bishop, and who kept trying to run away from the honor of it. He preferred the company of birds. He went out to a still smaller and bleaker island nearby and lived alone there in a stone cell with a wall built so high he could see nothing but the sky, on the reasonable grounds that the sky was the only thing he wished to look at. He is supposed to have made rules protecting the eider ducks that nested around him, which is one of the earliest bird protection laws anywhere. And those ducks are still called Cuddy's ducks on that coast, after him 1,200 years later. When Cuthbert died and was buried, and then, as the custom was, dug up 11 years later so his bones could be washed and placed in a finer shrine, the brothers opened the coffin and found the body, they said, undecayed, the limbs still soft, the vestments still fresh. Whatever the truth of that, the effect was immediate and enormous. Lindisfarne became a place of pilgrimage. Kings gave it land, nobles gave it silver, its shrine filled with offerings, and its church filled with the sort of objects people leave when they are frightened or grateful. And so, by the last decade of the 8th century, the island held a great shrine, a great library. A great deal of gold and silver, roughly a few dozen monks and their servants and tenants, and not one single soldier. Across the water in the wider world, the Northumbrian church was famous. Its scholars had been exported. The most celebrated Englishman alive at that moment was a Northumbrian called Alcuin, educated at York, who had been recruited by Charlemagne to run the schools of the Frankish Empire and who was, in effect, the minister of education for most of Western Europe. He wrote letters constantly, in beautiful Latin, to bishops and kings and old friends at home, mostly telling them that standards were slipping. He worried about the Northumbrian nobility's love of fine clothes and their trimmed beards, and their habit of listening to heroic songs about pagan ancestors when they might have been listening to Scripture. He was, in the way of men who have made a career abroad, very slightly insufferable about the homeland. Nobody, including Alcuin, thought the danger to Northumbria came from the sea. So return now to the tide. It is the 8th of June in the year 793, or near enough to that date, and the sky over the island is that flat, bright northern white that gives no shadows. Everything ordinary is happening. Someone is boiling something. Someone is mending a net. The bell has rung for one of the day's offices, and the church is half full, and the candles are lit. And the ships come in on the tide and run up the sand, and the men come out of them. We do not know how many, probably a few dozen. They would have been dressed, mostly, in wool, much like the wool the monks wore, dyed in stronger colors, with leather shoes and belts hung with practical things. And many of them would have carried spears rather than swords, because a sword took a smith a very long time to make, and cost as much as a small farm. The wealthiest among them wore a mail shirt and a simple iron helmet with a nose guard. There were no horns on it, and there never were, and the horned helmet is entirely an invention of 19th century opera. A detail which took hold so completely that it is now impossible to remove, and which would have baffled every man on that beach. What followed was quick, and the sources give it to us in short, broken phrases, because the men who wrote them were writing about the end of their world and had no appetite for detail. The raiders came to the church. They took what was on the altars and what was in the shrine. They stripped the covers from the books and left the pages, because parchment is worth nothing to a man in a boat, and they killed some of the brothers, and they drove others out into the water, and they took the young and healthy away with them, because a healthy person was cargo. And the slave markets of the north and the east paid extremely well. Then they put the treasure and the captives into the shallow hulls, and pushed off, and the tide carried them out, and by evening the sea was empty again, and the birds had come back, and the church was standing there with its doors open, and its floor scattered with unbound pages that nobody had thought worth stealing. It is those pages that make the thing so hard to bear. Somebody had put 10,000 red dots on a page. Somebody else pulled the jeweled cover off it and threw the rest on the ground. The news traveled the way bad news did in that century, slowly, by messenger and by rumor and by merchant. And it reached Alcuin at the Frankish court within a few months, and he sat down and wrote one of the most quoted letters in early English history. He told the king of Northumbria and the brothers of Lindisfarne that never before had such a terror appeared in Britain as they had now suffered from a pagan people, nor was it thought possible that such an inroad from the sea could be made. And then, because he was a churchman of his age and could not help himself, he explained why it had happened. It had happened because of their sins, because of the fine clothes, and the trimmed beards, and the drinking, and the pagan songs, and the general laxity he had been complaining about in letters for years, and which nobody had done anything about. There is something almost comic in the speed with which a scholar abroad converted a catastrophe into a vindication of his correspondence, and something very human in it too. Because the alternative explanation, the true one, was unbearable. The true explanation was that it had happened because the sea was open and the church was rich, and there was nothing in the water to stop anyone. A world in which God is punishing you is a world that still makes sense, and in which the remedy is obvious and lies in your own hands. A world in which men with better boats can simply come and take your treasure whenever the wind is right is a different kind of world entirely, and it took Britain about 70 years to accept that it was living in it. The raids did not stop. The very next year, they hit the twin monastery of Wearmouth and Jarrow further down the coast. The house where the great historian Bede had lived and written and died some 60 years earlier, though this time the local people caught them on the shore and killed one of their leaders, and a storm smashed some of the ships, which the chroniclers recorded with enormous satisfaction. The year after that, they were in the west, at the monastery of Iona off the Scottish coast, the mother house of the Irish Church in Britain, and they came back to Iona again and again over the following years until the community finally gave up and carried its relics inland to Ireland, which is one of the earliest examples of a pattern that would repeat all over Britain and Ireland for the next century. The pattern was this: a monastery is raided. It rebuilds because the land and the tenants and the rent are still there. It is raided again. It rebuilds again, but keeps its treasure lighter and its most precious relics in a portable box. It is raided a third time, and the community, exhausted, picks up the box and walks inland, and the buildings on the headland are left to the grass. Wherever you go along the coasts of these islands, you can find the sites where that decision was made. Some of them are still there in outline in the turf, low green humps in a field above a beach, exactly as a farmer's plow has left them. For a generation or so, the raiding was seasonal and small, and from the point of view of the men doing it, extremely profitable and very low risk. You sailed in the good months, you took what was on the coast, and you went home to your farm for the winter with silver enough to buy cattle and land and a reputation. Then, in the 1830s and 40s of that century, which is to say the 830s and 40s, the operation began to change shape, and the change is the hinge on which the whole history turns. The fleets got bigger. Instead of 3 ships, you get 35 ships, and then 100, and then, on the continent, several hundred. The target stopped being only monasteries and started being towns and trading places and royal estates. The raiders began sailing up the great rivers deep inland into Francia along the Seine and the Loire, into Ireland, where they established a permanent base at a place they called the Black Pool, which is Dublin, and into the rivers of eastern England. And then came the change that mattered most. They stopped going home for the winter. The first time a Viking fleet overwintered on an island in the Thames estuary in the middle of the 9th century, an English king should have understood immediately what it meant, though it is not clear that anyone did. A raider who goes home in autumn is weather. A raider who stays through the winter is a neighbor and eventually a claimant. Overwintering meant they could begin campaigning in the very earliest spring, before the harvest was in and before any local force could be raised. It meant they could learn the country, the roads, the fords, the rivalries, which lord hated which lord, which king was old, and which heir was weak. It meant they could take horses. And the moment they had horses, they stopped being a coastal problem and became an inland one, moving 100 miles across a kingdom in a few days while the king's levies were still being called out of their villages. And it meant In the end, that some of them started to look at the land itself rather than at the silver on the altars, and a man who wants land does not sail away in September. Why did the English kingdoms not simply crush them? It is the question every listener asks, and the answer is not cowardice or incompetence. The answer is structural. An English kingdom in the 9th century had no standing army. It had a king, a few hundred professional warriors in his household and in the households of his great men, and beyond that, the fyrd, the general levy, which was the free land-holding population summoned to fight when required. The fyrd was not useless, but it was slow to gather. It was made up of farmers who needed to be home for the harvest, and it dissolved after a set period of service because there was no way to feed it in the field. Against that, you had a Viking force that was permanently mobilized, that carried no obligations home, that could concentrate its whole strength wherever it liked and simply decline battle whenever the odds looked poor. It is the classic asymmetry of a mobile professional force against a settled agricultural one, and it favors the mobile force almost every time, for as long as the settled society refuses to change its institutions. The other reason is that Britain was not one country and had no interest in becoming one. Northumbria in these years was tearing itself apart in a civil war between rival kings. Mercia had lost its great ruler and its supremacy, and was quarreling over the succession. Wessex was rising, quietly, under a capable king called Egbert, who had beaten the Mercians in battle and pushed his authority east into Kent. But Wessex had its own coastline to defend, and no reason at all to spend its men saving Northumbria. Each kingdom fought its own war, and lost it in its own time, in its own way, and there was no moment when they all stood together. And that is precisely why a force that was never all that large by the standards of continental warfare was able to overturn almost everything. So the middle decades of the 9th century pass in a long, grinding rhythm that the chronicles record almost wearily. A fleet lands in Kent. A fleet lands in Somerset. The men of Devon fight them at one place, the men of Dorset at another. Sometimes the English win, and sometimes they lose, and the sentence that follows either way is the same, that the raiders held the place of slaughter, or that they went away to their ships. The rich trading town of Southampton is attacked. London is attacked and burned, and London at that date is not a capital, but a Mercian port on the tidal river. All timber wharves and warehouses, and it burns very well. Canterbury is attacked, the seat of the Archbishop, the oldest Christian place in England, and still each of these is, from the raider's point of view, an incident rather than a campaign, a season's work, a way of getting silver. Then, in the autumn of the year 865, a fleet came ashore in East Anglia that was not there for a season. The chroniclers, who had spent 70 years reaching for words, found the right one at last, and called it the Great Heathen Army. We do not know how large it was. Estimates have swung wildly across the last 2 centuries, from a few hundred men to many thousands, and the honest answer is that a force of perhaps 1,000 to 3,000 fighting men, growing as new fleets joined and shrinking as contingents left, fits the evidence best. That may sound modest. It is not. In a country where a great lord might bring 50 household warriors to a fight, and a king might struggle to hold 400 men in the field through a whole summer. What made this army different was not only its size, but its composition. It was a coalition. It was made up of war bands from Denmark and from Norway, and from the Norse settlements in Ireland and the Isles. Each under its own leader, each with its own following, held together by the promise of gain and by the reputations of a small number of commanders. Later Scandinavian tradition gave those commanders a magnificent origin story. It said they were the sons of a legendary sea king called Ragnar Hairy Breeches, and that they had come to Britain to avenge their father, who had supposedly been captured by the Northumbrians and thrown into a pit of snakes, and who had died reciting a poem about how the little pigs would grunt when they learned how the old boar had suffered. The little pigs, in this image, were his sons. It is a wonderful story, and it is almost certainly a later literary construction, a simple generations afterwards, out of poetry and pride. What is not in doubt is that several of the men it names were real, and that they were the most successful war leaders of their age, and that their names run through the English chronicles like a repeated drumbeat. There was Ivar, called the Boneless, whose nickname has been explained as everything from a physical condition to a compliment about his flexibility of mind, and about whom the sources agree on only one thing, which is that he was extraordinarily dangerous. There was Halfdan. There was Ubba. Later, there were others, Guthrum above all. They landed in East Anglia in the autumn, and East Anglia, being small and rich and entirely unable to fight them, did the sensible thing and bought them off, and the price was not only silver, but horses. Think about that transaction for a moment, because it is one of the most consequential purchases in English history. The king of the East Angles, wanting one bad winter to end quietly, handed a seaborne army the one thing it lacked. From that moment, the great heathen army was mounted infantry. They did not fight on horseback in the manner of later knights. They rode to the battle and got off and fought on foot in a shield wall, which is exactly what makes horses so useful, because it means an army can appear 2 counties away from where it was last seen and arrive fresh. In the spring, they rode north. Northumbria at that moment was doing what Northumbria always did, which was fighting itself. 2 rival kings, one called Osbert and one called Aella, were disputing the throne, and each had a faction, and neither would yield. The army crossed the Humber and took the city of York on the 1st of November, which is All Saints' Day, when a great part of the population would have been inside the churches. York was the greatest city in the north, a former Roman legionary fortress with walls still standing in places, an archbishop, a mint, and a river running up to it from the sea, and it fell in a day. The 2 rival kings, faced at last with something worse than each other, patched up their quarrel over the winter and combined their forces and came to York in the following March and attacked. They broke into the city, which was the worst possible outcome for them, because fighting inside a warren of streets and ruined Roman walls dissolved any advantage of numbers, and both kings were killed and their army was destroyed. Northumbria, the kingdom of Bede and Cuthbert and the great libraries, the kingdom that had once produced the finest books in Europe, ceased in that hour to be an independent power and never became one again. The army did not at this point take the land for itself. It installed an Englishman as a puppet king in the north to collect the taxes and keep order, and rode south again because there was more to do. This became their method, and it is worth naming, because it shows how much more sophisticated they were than the raiders of 70 years earlier. They would beat a kingdom in the field, kill or drive out its king, put in a compliant local man to run the machinery, extract as much silver as the countryside could bear, and move on, returning later to convert that arrangement into direct settlement whenever it suited. It is not the behavior of a horde. It is the behavior of an organization that has read the political map. Next came Mercia. They rode down and seized Nottingham and settled into it for the winter, and the king of Mercia, unable to shift them, sent for help to Wessex, and this is the moment when our story finds the family it will follow for the rest of the century. The king of Wessex was Ethelred, and he came north with his younger brother, and the brother was a young man of perhaps 19 or 20 called Alfred. The combined English armies came to Nottingham and found the Danes behind the town's defenses and declining to come out, and the English had no capacity whatsoever to take a fortified place by storm, so after a period of glaring at each other across a ditch, the mercenaries made peace and paid, and everyone went home. Alfred's first campaign, therefore, was a lesson in an unpleasant truth, that an enemy who will not fight you unless he likes the odds cannot be beaten by courage. The army went back to York, sat out a year, and then turned on East Anglia again, the kingdom that had sold them the horses. This time there was no purchase to be made. The king of the East Angles was a young man called Edmund, and he fought them, and he lost. And he was captured and killed in the winter of 869. Almost immediately, the manner of his death began to grow into legend, and within a generation he was being venerated as a martyr who had refused to renounce his faith or to rule as a pagan king's client. And shrines were raised, and in time the greatest abbey in East Anglia grew around his tomb, and the town around it took his name, which it still carries, Bury St. Edmunds. It is one of the stranger ironies of this age that the Danish settlers who came to live in East Anglia within a few years were, within 2 generations, minting coins in honor of the saint their fathers had killed. So in the space of 5 years, 3 of the 4 great English kingdoms had been broken. Northumbria was a puppet state. East Anglia was leaderless and occupied. Mercia was paying and would shortly be partitioned, and the army, having finished the north and the east, turned its horses south towards the last kingdom standing, and rode into Wessex at the very end of the year 870, and took the royal estate at Reading, where 2 rivers meet, and dug a ditch and a rampart between the rivers, and made a fortress of it, and sat down inside it, and waited for the English to come and be beaten. The year that followed was afterwards remembered simply as the year of battles, and it very nearly finished Wessex. There were 9 general engagements fought south of the Thames in 12 months, besides countless small raids and skirmishes that nobody bothered to count. And the West Saxons fought them all with a levy of farmers who had crops in the ground. The first attempt to storm the fortress at Reading went badly, as attempts to storm fortresses always did. Then, a few days later, on a bare chalk ridge in Berkshire, the 2 armies met in the open at a place the chroniclers called Ashdown, and there the English won. The story that came down about that battle is one of the best loved in English history, and it hangs on a small piece of family friction. The Danish force had drawn up in 2 divisions, so the English divided in 2 as well, the king taking one and his young brother the other. And then, when the moment came to advance, the king would not move, because he was in his tent hearing Mass, and had said he would not stir until the priest had finished. His brother, standing out on the cold hillside, with the enemy coming down the slope towards him, waited as long as he could bear, and then attacked anyway, uphill, with half an army, and held long enough for the king to arrive with his devotions properly completed. The English broke them and chased them across the downs until dark, and 1 Danish king and 5 jarls were left on the field. It was the first real victory any English army had won against the great heathen army, and it made the reputation of the younger brother at a stroke. It did not, however, win the war. Within a fortnight the Danes had fought back and beaten them at Basing, and then again at Meritoun, and in the middle of all this, in the spring, King Ethelred died. Whether of wounds or illness we do not know. He left small sons, and Wessex, faced with the choice between a child and a proven soldier, chose the soldier. So in the spring of the year 871, at about the age of 22, Alfred became king of the West Saxons and inherited a war he was losing. He fought another battle almost at once and lost it, and then he did the thing that his admirers have found awkward ever since. He paid. He bought peace with silver, and the army withdrew to London for the winter, and Wessex had a few years to breathe. There is nothing shameful in it, whatever the later legends preferred. A king who buys a year is a king who still has a kingdom at the end of the year, and Alfred needed years more than he needed glory. He used them. While Wessex rested, the army finished what it had begun elsewhere. It drove out the king of Mercia, replaced him with a client, and then, in the mid-870s, came the moment when the whole nature of the invasion changed for good. The great army split. One half, under Halfdan, went north to Northumbria, and there, in the year 876, the chronicle records in one astonishing short sentence that he shared out the land, and they proceeded to plow and to support themselves. Read that again slowly, because 100 years of raiding turns on it. They divided the fields, they took up the plow. The men who had come for the silver on the altars were now, some of them, farmers in Yorkshire, with a share of arable and a household to feed, and their children would be born there and buried there. The same thing happened in the following years in the East Midlands around the 5 great towns of Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, Stamford, and Leicester, and then in East Anglia, and what emerged from those settlements is the thing this whole story is really about, the region that would later be called the Danelaw. We will come back to it properly and walk through its farms and its markets and its words, because it is the most interesting part of the age. But first Wessex had to survive, and in the winter of 877 Wessex very nearly did not. The other half of the army, under Guthrum, had spent several years working around the edges of Wessex with real cunning. They seized Wareham in Dorset, a place tucked between 2 rivers behind old earthworks, and Alfred came and blockaded them and eventually made terms, and the terms included the most solemn oaths available, sworn on a sacred ring, and hostages exchanged. They broke the oaths at once, killed the hostages, and slipped out by night to Exeter. Alfred marched after them. A Danish fleet coming to reinforce them was wrecked in a great storm off the Dorset coast, which cost them 120 ships and did more for Wessex that year than any English army. And Guthrum, isolated, made peace again and withdrew into Mercia. And there, the chroniclers say, they settled for the season. Which brings us to the 12th night of Christmas, in the January of the year 878, at the royal estate of Chippenham in Wiltshire, where the King of Wessex was keeping the feast. Midwinter was a truce that everyone observed. Armies did not move in January. The roads were mud, the days were short, there was no forage in the fields, and men were at home with their families eating the last of the autumn slaughter. The king was at Chippenham with his household and his officials and their wives, and there would have been feasting and fires and the deep sleep of people who have eaten a great deal of pork. Guthrum rode through the dark across country in winter and fell on Chippenham without warning. It was a raid of extraordinary nerve, and it came within a hair of ending the independent English monarchy in a single night. Most of the king's household was killed or scattered. A great part of the population of Wiltshire and Hampshire submitted on the spot, because their king had vanished and a Danish army was in their county in the middle of winter and no help was coming. Many of the leading men took ship and fled overseas, and Alfred, with a handful of companions, went west into the marshes. Now, everything I have described so far in this story is more or less firmly recorded. What happens next is recorded too, but it is also wrapped in about 800 years of legend, and it is worth separating the two gently, because both are lovely in their own way. The recorded part is this. In the early weeks of 878, the King of Wessex was a fugitive in the Somerset levels, which at that date were not the drained green pastures of today, but a vast waterlogged wilderness of reed and alder and black peat, laced with slow channels and dotted with islands of firm ground that could only be reached by boat or by paths known to locals. He based himself on one such island, a low rise called Athelney, and he built a small fort there. And from it he and his few men lived by raiding the Danes and, the chronicle admits without embarrassment, by raiding the local English as well, because a warband has to eat. He sent messengers out through the marsh quietly, week after week, to the men of Somerset and Wiltshire and Hampshire, who had not submitted. And the legendary part is the story of the cakes, which appears 100 years or more after the event and is almost certainly untrue and has been told to English children ever since. In it, the king shelters unrecognized in a swineherd's hut, and the man's wife, busy, tells him to keep an eye on the loaves baking by the fire, and he sits there brooding on the ruin of his kingdom and lets them burn. And she comes back and gives him the sharp end of her tongue for it, and he takes it meekly, because she is right, and he did burn the cakes. It has survived 1,000 years for the obvious reason that it is the only moment in the entire heroic literature of the period in which a king is scolded by a woman about baking and simply accepts it. Spring came to the levels the way it does in low wet country, all at once and very green. In the 7th week after Easter, in early May, the messengers who had been going quietly out through the marsh all winter finally did what they had been sent to do. The king rode out of the reeds to a place the chronicle calls Egbert Stone, on the eastern edge of Selwood, and there the men of Somerset and Wiltshire and the part of Hampshire that had not fled overseas came to meet him. And the chronicler, who was not a sentimental man and who wrote in short flat clauses about the deaths of kings, allowed himself one sentence of pure feeling about that meeting, saying that they were glad of him. They were glad of him. After a winter in which everyone had assumed the kingdom was finished, the farmers of 3 counties walked to a stone in the woods and found their king alive. And the man, writing it down 40 years later, still could not get past how that had felt. They camped one night and moved to Iley Oak and camped again, and on the 3rd day they came to Eddington on the chalk downs of Wiltshire. And there they found Guthrum's army drawn up, and there the whole 300 years' story turned. The fighting itself would have looked like every battle of that age. 2 dense masses of men on foot, each behind a wall of round wooden shields with iron bosses overlapping like the planks of a ship, spears out over the top. It was less like a duel and more like an enormous shoving match conducted with edged weapons, in which the decisive factor was not skill, but whether your line held its shape when men in it began to fall. Battles were won when one shield wall lost its nerve and opened, and then they stopped being battles at all. At Edington, the Danish wall opened. The English drove them off the field and pursued them all the way back to their fortress, took everything outside it, the horses and the cattle and the men who could not get through the gate in time, and then sat down around the walls and waited. After a fortnight of that, with no food coming in and no fleet coming to help, Guthrum sent out to ask for terms. And here is where Alfred of Wessex becomes something more interesting than a successful war leader, because the terms he set are not the terms a triumphant king of that century would be expected to set. He did not demand the Danes leave Britain, which he could not have enforced. He did not take a great tribute, or execute the leaders, or sell the survivors. He asked for hostages and oaths, as anyone would, and then he asked Guthrum to be baptized and to become his godson. 3 weeks later, at a place called Aller in Somerset, not far from the marshes where the king had been hiding at midwinter, Guthrum and 30 of his chief men came to a church and were baptized. And the king of Wessex stood as sponsor and lifted his enemy from the font and gave him a new name, Athelstan, an English royal name. And then the whole party went on to another royal estate and feasted together for 12 days, and at the end of it the Danes were given great gifts and rode away east. Now, was that conversion sincere? Almost certainly not in the sense a bishop would have liked. Guthrum was a practical man who had just lost a war and been offered a way out that cost him nothing he valued. But sincerity was not the point, and Alfred knew exactly what he was buying. Baptism turned a pagan warlord into a Christian king, and a Christian king was inside the system. He could make treaties that other Christian kings would recognize. He could be held to oaths sworn on relics that his own new clergy would witness. He could be a godson, and in that age, godfatherhood was a real and heavy bond of subordination, the junior partner in a family relationship that everyone in Europe understood. In one afternoon at a font, Alfred moved his enemy from the category of thing that must be destroyed into the category of neighbor who can be dealt with. It is one of the shrewdest pieces of statecraft in early medieval history, and it was done with water and a feast. A few years later, the two of them, the West Saxon king and his Danish godson, set their names to a written agreement, and a copy of it survives, and it is worth describing because it is such an oddly modern document. It begins by saying that this is the peace which Alfred the king and Guthrum the king and the councillors of all the English nation and all the people who are in East Anglia have all agreed on and confirmed with oaths for themselves and for their descendants, both for the born and the unborn. Then it draws a line. Up the Thames, then up the River Lee to its source. Then in a straight line to Bedford, then up the River Ouse to Watling Street, which was the old Roman road running northwest across the island. Everything north and east of that line was theirs. Everything south and west was his. It is a border defined by rivers and a Roman road, agreed between an Englishman and a Dane. And the line it draws across the middle of England is still faintly visible today in dialect, in field names, in the shape of the counties, and in the ordinary vocabulary of everybody who lives there. And then the treaty does something more remarkable than dividing land. It sets out the compensation to be paid if an Englishman kills a Dane, or a Dane kills an Englishman. And it makes the figure the same for both, 8 half marks of pure gold for a nobleman on either side, and it sets equal figures for free men on either side too. Whatever else this is, it is a legal recognition that the two peoples on this island were now going to have to live next to each other, buy and sell from each other, and occasionally kill each other, and that when they did. The law would treat their lives as being of equal value. Very few peace treaties in any century begin from that assumption. It also included rules about trade across the line, requiring anyone crossing to buy cattle or goods to have proper witnesses, which is the sort of clause you only bother to write when you fully expect a great deal of cross-border cattle dealing, and which tells you that within a very few years of Eddington, the ordinary business of markets had resumed straight across the frontier of a war. That is how these things really go. The chronicles record the battles because battles are events. The farmers went on selling each other oxen because oxen do not care whose god you follow. What Alfred did with the peace is the reason he is the only English king ever to be called the Great, and none of it involves a battle. He had spent 7 years learning in the hardest possible way exactly why his kingdom kept losing, and he now set about removing every one of those reasons, patiently, one at a time, over the better part of 2 decades. The first problem was that the enemy could go anywhere and there was nowhere safe to go. So he built the burhs. A burh was a fortified place, sometimes a repaired Roman wall town, sometimes an old hill fort brought back into use, sometimes a completely new site laid out from nothing on a river crossing, and the whole point of them was the network rather than any individual stronghold. A document survives, made a few years after his death, called the Burgel Hieraje, which lists more than 30 of them across Wessex with the amount of land assigned to maintain each one. And from that list, historians worked out something rather beautiful. Almost nowhere in Wessex was more than about 20 miles from a burh, which is to say no farm was more than a single day's walk from safety, so a family could take its cattle and its grain and its children behind a wall in the time it took a raiding party to come inland. And each burh was allotted so many hides of surrounding land, and each hide had to send one man to defend the walls. And the arithmetic works out at almost exactly 4 men for every 5.5 yards of rampart, which is the correct density for defending a wall by the standards of Roman military manuals. Somebody sat down with a measuring rod and a tax list and did the sums. The new towns were laid out with straight streets on a grid, with a road running just inside the wall all the way round so defenders could be moved quickly to any threatened point, and with plots for merchants and craftsmen along the main streets. And this had an effect nobody could have fully intended, which is that a defensive scheme became an economic one. If the safest place to keep goods is inside the walls, that is where the market goes. If the market is there, that is where the money sets up. If the coins are struck there, that is where the traders come. A dozen English towns that are still busy today, with their high street still running exactly where it was pegged out, began as an answer to a military problem. Winchester's street plan is essentially the one laid down in this period. So is Wallingford's and Oxford's corps and Wareham's. The second problem was that the army dissolved every autumn. So he reorganized the fyrd on a rota, dividing it so that half the men were in the field while the other half were at home working the land, and then they changed over. It was not a standing army, but it meant that for the first time an English force could stay in existence through a whole campaigning season, and could keep a Danish force under observation for months instead of melting away just when it mattered. The third problem was the ships. If the enemy owns the sea, he chooses every fight. So Alfred ordered ships built to his own specification, and the chronicler, who was clearly quoting someone proud, says they were nearly twice as long as the others, some with 60 oars and some with more, and that they were neither on the Frisian pattern nor the Danish, but as it seemed to the king himself that they might be most useful. They were not an unqualified success. Their first outing involved a comic and rather humiliating episode in which the great long English ships ran aground in a narrow creek at low tide, and the fighting had to be finished on foot in the mud, and then, when the tide came in, the Danish ships, being shallower, floated off first and escaped. Building a navy from nothing takes more than one attempt. But it was the beginning of a permanent English capacity at sea, and later kings would use it. The fourth problem was law. Alfred issued a law code, and the way he assembled it tells you a great deal about him. He gathered the laws of his predecessors and of the Mercian and Kentish kings before him, and, as he says himself, those which he liked he kept, and those he did not like he rejected with the advice of his counselors, and he did not dare presume to set down much of his own, because he did not know what would please those who came after. That is an astonishing sentence for a 9th century monarch. It is a king saying that the law is a thing held in trust, and that his own opinion is not the highest authority in the room. He prefaced the whole code with a long translation of the commandments and passages from Scripture, then a summary of the Church's history, and only then the practical clauses which run through the price of every injury a man can suffer with a thoroughness that is oddly soothing to read. There is a compensation figure for the loss of a thumb and a different one for the nail of the thumb, for the front tooth and the back tooth, for a wound that shows above the clothes and a wound that does not. Behind this endless tariff sits an entire philosophy of order, which is that violence is not to be answered with violence, but converted into a debt, because a debt can be paid and a feud cannot. The fifth problem, and the one he seems to have felt most personally, was that his kingdom had forgotten how to read. He wrote about it in a letter sent out to all his bishops, and there is real grief in it. He remembered, he said, what wise men there had once been throughout England, and how kings had obeyed God, and how people had come here from abroad to seek wisdom, and how now if anyone wanted to acquire it, they had to go elsewhere. He said that when he came to the throne, he could not think of a single priest south of the Thames who could translate a letter from Latin into English. Decades of raiding had burned the libraries and killed or scattered the teachers, and the schools had simply stopped. And a great civilization had gone quietly illiterate in a single lifetime. So he did the only thing he could think of, which was to learn Latin himself as an adult, as a working king in his late 30s, and then to translate books into English, personally, with a team of scholars he had recruited from Mercia and Wales and the continent. He picked the books he thought a man in authority most needed, the ones he described as most necessary for all men to know: a handbook on the duties of a pastor, a history of the English Church, a universal history, the consolations of philosophy written by a Roman senator in prison awaiting execution, and the Reflections of St. Augustine. He founded schools where the sons of freemen as well as of nobles were to learn to read English first and Latin afterwards, which was, at the time, a genuinely radical ordering of priorities. And he ordered that the chronicle of the English people be kept and copied and sent out to the monasteries to be continued year by year, which is the reason we have so much of this story at all, and the reason a chronicler in a cold room somewhere could write down that the men of 3 counties were glad of him. He also, being the kind of man he was, worried about time. He wanted to divide his day so that a fixed share went to God, and he found that he could not measure hours reliably, because the sun was often invisible for weeks in an English winter. So he had candles made to a standard weight, marked in bands, that burned at a known rate, and when the draughts in his hall and his tent made them gutter and burn unevenly, he had a lantern built of wood and thin scraped ox horn, translucent enough to let the light out and solid enough to keep the wind off. It is a very small thing next to the burrs and the law code. But there is something about a king inventing a lantern, because he cannot otherwise keep track of the hours that stays with you longer than the battles do. The test of all this machinery came in the last years of his reign, and the machinery passed. In the autumn of the year 892, a very large force crossed from the continent. Where a run of bad harvests and a stiffening Frankish defense had made the old business unprofitable, and they came over in 2 fleets, one of 250 ships and one of 80, and they brought their horses with them, and they brought their wives and children too, which meant they had come to stay. 4 years of hard campaigning followed, up and down the country, from Kent to the Severn to Chester to the Thames Valley. And what is striking about that war, compared with the war of Alfred's youth, is how little the invaders achieved. They could no longer live off the countryside, because the countryside emptied into the burrs at a day's notice, and the food went with it. They could no longer besiege at leisure, because the reorganized Fyrd could keep a force in the field opposite them for months. When they built a fortress on the River Lee, the English army came up and built 2 forts of their own downstream and began driving stakes into the riverbed to block the channel. And the Danish fleet, seeing that it was about to be trapped upstream forever, abandoned the ships entirely and walked away overland. And the Londoners came up and took the ships home. When one Danish force did break out and ride the whole width of England in a dash to the Welsh border, they were followed and cornered and starved and had to eat their horses. By the year 896, the great army simply dispersed, some to East Anglia and Northumbria to settle among their countrymen, some back across the sea to the Seine. And the chronicler records with visible relief that the enemy host had not, thank God, entirely broken up the English nation. Alfred died 3 years later, in the autumn of 899, at about 50 years old, having been ill for most of his adult life with some painful recurring internal complaint his biographer describes at length and no modern doctor can confidently name. He had not driven the Danes out of Britain. Half of England was still under their law and would remain so for 2 more generations. But he had done something that turned out to matter more, which is that he had built a kingdom capable of surviving him, with towns, walls, ships, courts, schools, and a written history, and he had begun to use a new phrase in his charters and his coins. Not king of the West Saxons, king of the Anglo-Saxons. The idea that the English were one people who ought to have one king did not exist in 793. It was largely manufactured in the middle of an emergency by a man who needed the mercenaries to fight alongside the West Saxons, and it outlived every single person involved. Now let us leave the kings for a while and go and look at the other half of the country, because while all of that was happening in Wessex, something much quieter and in the long run much more important was happening in the north and east. The Danelaw was being made, and it was being made not by armies but by households. Picture a valley in Yorkshire in the last quarter of the 9th century. The land here has been farmed for centuries. This is not wilderness. There are English villages with English names in the good bottom land, and there are churches, and there are estates belonging to great men and to monasteries. Into this arrives a shipload, or the remnant of a war band, some 50 or 80 men with an agreed claim to a district, and the land is shared out. What actually happened at ground level has been argued over for a century and a half. The old picture was of mass migration, tens of thousands of Danish families pouring into eastern England and displacing the natives. The revised picture was of a small warrior elite, a few thousand men at most, simply taking over the top layer of an existing society, marrying local women and leaving the peasantry where it was. The current picture is somewhere between the two and varies enormously from district to district, and the honest summary is that in some valleys the Scandinavian presence was thick enough to change every farm name within a generation, and in others it amounted to a new lord in the hall and nothing else. But there is one thing the evidence agrees on everywhere, and it is the thing that surprises people. These were not in the main plantations of soldiers, they were farms. The archaeology of the Danelaw is overwhelmingly agricultural. It is post holes and byres and grain dryers, spindle whorls and loom weights, cattle bones and sheep bones, and the small worn tools of ordinary life. A man who had spent 10 years in the shield wall took a share of arable in a valley he had first seen through a rain of arrows, and then spent the rest of his life doing what his father had done in Jutland, which was worrying about the weather. The place names are the loudest evidence, and once you learn to hear them, you cannot stop hearing them. Because a great swathe of the map of England is speaking Old Norse and has been for 1100 years. The commonest ending is by, which in Danish simply means a farm or a village, and it appears well over 600 times across the north and east, hardly ever west or south of the treaty line. Grimsby is Grim's Farm. Whitby is the White Settlement. Derby is the village by the deer park. Selby, Rugby, Formby, Corby, Wetherby, Thoresby, Ferriby, on and on. Then there is Thorpe, which meant a secondary settlement, an outlying hamlet dependent on a bigger place. And it gives you Scunthorpe and Cleethorpes and Bishopthorpe and hundreds of small, quiet thorps scattered through Lincolnshire and Yorkshire like crumbs. Then Thwaite, which meant a clearing or a meadow won from the woods, common in the northwest in Bassenthwaite and Braithwaite and Applethwaite. Then Toft, a homestead plot in Lowestoft and Langtoft. And Beck for a stream, and Fell for a hill, and Dale for a valley, and Gill for a ravine, and Holm for an island in a river, and Ness for a headland, and Thing for an assembly, which is why there is a Thingwall on the Wirral and a Tynewald on the Isle of Man, and the Manx Parliament still carries that name today and is one of the oldest continuous assemblies on earth. There is a subtler category still, and it is my favorite, because it catches the two peoples in the act of mixing. These are the hybrid names. where a Norse personal name has been stuck on the front of a perfectly ordinary English word, or the other way round. Grimston is a good example, and there are many like it. Grim is a Scandinavian name, and tun is the English word for a farmstead, and what that almost certainly records is an existing English village that was handed over to a Danish lord, so that the neighbors went on calling it what they had always called it, but changed the owner's name at the front. Nobody moved. Nobody was driven out. The rent simply started going to a man called Grim, and the village has carried the fact in its name ever since, past the Normans, past the Tudors, past the railways, right up to the sign at the edge of the road tonight. The administrative map went the same way. In Yorkshire, the county was divided into 3 parts, and the word for a third in Old Norse is Thrithjungur, which the English mouth wore down into writing, so that until 1974, the ridings of Yorkshire were officially the North, the West, and the East, and no one thought to ask why there was no South riding, when the answer is simply that you cannot have 4 thirds. In the East Midlands and the North, the unit of local government beneath the shire was not called 100 as in the South, but a wapentake, from a Norse word meaning the taking or flourishing of weapons, because at the assembly the free men signaled their assent by brandishing their spears. And the sound of a decision being taken was the clash of weapon on weapon. There is an entire theory of government in that word. Assent is not silent, and it is not written. It is a noise made by armed men who could, in principle, refuse. Which brings us to the most persistent legacy of the settlement, the one visible in tax records 2 centuries later. The Danelaw counties had, by a very wide margin, the largest population of free peasants in England. In the great survey the Normans made in 1086, the eastern counties are full of a class of men called sokemen, who held their land with real independence, owing dues and attendance at court, but not the heavy labor service that bound a villain in the South to work his lord's fields 2 or 3 days a week. In Lincolnshire, nearly half the recorded rural population fell into these freer categories. In parts of Sussex or Wiltshire, the figure was almost nothing. Historians have argued for a century about whether that freedom was a direct import of Scandinavian custom, in which a farmer was a man who spoke at the assembly and carried a spear, or whether it was the accidental result of an army sharing out land among a few thousand ordinary soldiers who all ended up with modest holdings and no great lord above them. It may well have been both. The result, either way, was a broad belt of eastern England where a peasant was harder to push around, and that difference lasted. And it shaped everything from the pattern of medieval revolts to the temperament of the region. There is a case to be made that the awkward independent-mindedness of the English East is a 900-year-old side effect of how the great heathen army divided its fields. The law itself kept the mark too. The word law is a Norse word, so is outlaw. So is by law, which meant the law of the village. So are the words for a legal case at law, and for the arrangement whereby a man was answerable at court. The English had perfectly good words for all these things and quietly dropped them, which is unusual because legal vocabulary is normally the most conservative in any language. What it suggests is that in a wide region, the actual working machinery of courts and assemblies was Danish for long enough that the terms stuck even after the politics changed. And the assembly, the thing, was the heart of it. It met in the open air, at a fixed place, often a mound or a stone or a crossing, at fixed times of the year. Free men attended, and disputes were argued out in front of everybody. There were no professional lawyers and no judges in the modern sense. There was a body of custom held in the memories of the older men, and there were oath helpers, which was a system whereby a man's case was strengthened by the number and quality of the neighbors willing to swear alongside him. In practice, this meant your reputation was your legal defense, and that a man everyone knew to be a liar could not find 12 neighbors and therefore lost. It is a rough system, and it favors the well-connected, but it also means the community itself is the court. And it worked well enough to run large districts of England for generations. The economy of the Danelaw ran on silver, and it ran on it in a very particular way that shows the two worlds meeting. Scandinavians did not at first think in coins. They thought in weight. Silver was silver, whether it came as a coin from the Caliphate, a coin from Francia, an arm ring, a brooch, or a lump chopped off something larger, and the word for that chopped up silver is hack silver, and you find it everywhere in the hoards, mixed together, coins bent and nicked with a knife to test whether they were solid or plated. Every trader carried a small folding balance and a set of neat lead or bronze weights, and archaeologists have dug up dozens of these little scales from the settlements. And they are strangely moving objects, because they show a man in the mud of a riverbank market weighing out fragments of an Arab dirham to buy a cow in Lincolnshire. The great silver rivers ran east through the Russian rivers to the Volga and the Caspian, and the coins came back west in the same hands. There is a hoard from northwest England, buried around the year 905 and found in a lead chest that contained more than 8,000 pieces of silver, coins from Wessex and from the Danelaw and from Francia and from the Islamic world, along with arm rings and ingots and hack silver, and it weighed something like 40 kilograms, and it is the largest Viking silver hoard ever found in Britain. Somebody buried it beside a river on the road between York and Dublin in a bad year, meaning to come back. And then, within a very few decades, the settlers stopped weighing and started minting. The Danish kings of York and East Anglia struck their own coins in their own names with Latin inscriptions on the English pattern, because a coinage that people trust is more useful than a bag of metal. That is the whole assimilation in one object. First, they took the silver off the altar. Then they weighed it. Then they minted it. Then they put a saint on it. And then there was the city. The Danes took the old Roman and English city of York and called it Jorvik. And over the following century they turned it into the second largest and richest town in Britain after London, with a population that may have reached 10 or 15,000 people, which in the 10th century was a genuine metropolis. We know more about daily life in Jorvik than about almost any other place in early medieval northern Europe, and the reason is delightfully unglamorous. The ground under one particular street is waterlogged, and waterlogged soil keeps out oxygen, and without oxygen, the things that normally rot do not. So when archaeologists dug down through Coppergate in the 1970s, they did not find the usual thin scatter of pottery and post holes. They found 9 meters of stratified, damp, oxygen-starved layers containing wooden buildings still standing to shoulder height, wicker fences, timber floors, leather shoes with the stitching intact, textiles, human hair, seeds, insects, wooden bowls with knife marks in them, and something like 40,000 individual objects, an entire street of an entire century pressed flat and pickled. Here is what that street was. The plots ran back at right angles from the road, long and narrow, each about 5 or 6 meters wide and 30 or more deep, and every plot had a building at the front with its gable end to the street. The boundaries between the plots stayed in exactly the same lines for over 100 years, replaced fence after fence, generation after generation, which tells you that property here was inherited and respected and probably registered somewhere in memory or in a court. The earliest buildings were post and wattle, upright stakes with hazel rods woven between them and daubs smeared over, roofed in thatch or turf with a hearth on the floor and no chimney. Later they were rebuilt with sunken floors and plank walls, half basements with steps going down, which kept the goods cool and the building warm. Behind each house was a yard with a well or a water barrel, a rubbish pit, and a cesspit. And the cesspits are, to an archaeologist, the treasure. Because in them survive the seeds and pollen and parasite eggs that tell you what people ate and what was wrong with them. What they ate, it turns out, was reasonably good and monotonous. Bread and porridge from barley and oats and some wheat, a very great deal of it. Beef, mutton and pork especially, since pigs could be kept in a small yard and fed on scraps. Chicken and goose and their eggs. Fish, both freshwater from the 2 rivers and sea fish brought up from the coast, including enormous quantities of herring, and there are cod bones in Jorvik large enough that the fish had to have come from deep water, which means boats were going properly out to sea for them. Cabbage, leeks, carrots, parsnips, peas, beans, apples, plums, sloes, bilberries, blackberries, elderberries, and a lot of hazelnuts, honey for sweetness, ale for nearly every drink, and a little imported wine for those who could afford it. And what was wrong with them was intestinal worms in almost everyone, in numbers that would horrify a modern doctor and which the people themselves probably regarded as simply part of being alive, along with lice, of which the combs found on the site are a silent and steady record, because that was the other thing about them. They combed their hair constantly. Combs are one of the commonest finds in every Scandinavian settlement in Britain. Beautifully made, cut from antler, riveted together from plates, with fine teeth on one side and coarse on the other. Often decorated and sometimes carried in their own protective cases. There is a well-known complaint from a later English writer grumbling that the Danish settlers were dangerously attractive to English women because they combed their hair daily, bathed on Saturdays, and changed their clothes regularly, thereby unfairly undermining the local competition. Whether or not that is a fair account of 11th century English grooming, the archaeology fully supports the combs. The workshops on Coppergate made things all day. The street name itself probably means the street of the cup makers, from the Norse for a wooden cup and the Norse word gata for a street, which is why so many streets in York end in gate to this day, Micklegate, the Great Street. Skeldergate, the Shieldmaker's Street, Fishergate, Coppergate, and why visitors reasonably assume they are named after city gates and are entirely wrong. On that one street there were wood-turners producing bowls by the 100 on pole lathes, leaving behind piles of the cone-shaped cores that a lathe cannot cut away. There were leather workers making shoes and scabbards and belts. There were smiths working iron into knives and nails and locks and keys, and other smiths working in copper alloy and lead and silver, making brooches and pins and rings, and a die for stamping coins was found there too. There were amber workers shaping beads from lumps that had washed up on the Baltic shore and traveled 1,000 miles to be drilled in Yorkshire. There were people spinning and weaving in every household, because cloth was a constant obligation and a woman's spindle was rarely idle. There was a silk cap made from cloth that had come from Byzantium or beyond, which somebody in a timber house by a muddy Yorkshire street had bought and worn. And there were ships coming up the river with cargo from Ireland and Norway and the Rhineland, and going back down loaded with wool and lead and grain. Imagine the sound of it at dusk. The hammering stops in ones and twos as the light goes. The pigs are shouting somewhere. The pole lathes creak and stop. There is smoke coming through every thatch on the street at once, so the whole town is under a low gray ceiling of it, and it smells of that, and of wet leather, and of the tannery, which is always downwind if the town has any sense, and never quite downwind enough. Somebody is singing badly. The two rivers move slowly past in the last light with masts along them and behind the timber houses. Half ruined and enormous, stand the walls of a Roman fortress that had been abandoned for 400 years and which nobody living can explain, and children play on them, and the great stone blocks are quietly being carried away one at a time to make the footings of a wall for a hall belonging to a man from Denmark. The strangest and gentlest part of the settlement is what happened to the gods. You would expect a long, bitter religious struggle. Pagans had burned the monasteries, the church had every reason to hate them, the two systems of belief had almost nothing in common. Instead, what the evidence shows is one of the quickest and least dramatic conversions in European history, and before it finished, a period of perhaps 2 or 3 generations in which the two religions sat down together and quietly borrowed each other's furniture. Within about 30 years of taking Northumbria, the Danish kings of York were striking coins with the name of St. Peter on them. Within a lifetime, the settlers were burying their dead in Christian churchyards, in Christian orientation, without the grave goods their grandparents would have insisted on. And in that overlapping period, they did something nobody else in Europe did, which was to carve their old stories onto Christian crosses in stone. There is a tall, slender cross standing in a churchyard in Cumbria at Gosforth. 4.5 meters of red sandstone, carved in the 10th century and never broken, which is itself a small miracle given the centuries of zeal that followed. On one side it shows the crucifixion, plainly and unmistakably, and around the rest of it are figures out of Norse myth, a god thrusting his hand into the mouth of a great wolf. A bound figure with a serpent above him and a woman holding a bowl to catch the venom, riders and monsters, and the long twisting knots of a world coming apart. Scholars have argued for a century about what the carver meant. The most persuasive reading is that he was doing what every missionary in history has done, which is telling the new story in the grammar of the old one. Your world ends in a last battle in which the gods die. Ours has a last day too. Your God hangs himself on a tree for 9 nights to win wisdom for mankind. Ours hangs on a tree as well. Look, it is the same shape. Come inside. Then there are the hogbacks, which are one of the most peculiar objects in British archaeology and are found almost only in the areas of Scandinavian settlement, from Yorkshire and Cumbria up into southern Scotland. A hogback is a solid block of stone, 1 meter or 2 long, laid over a grave, curved along the top like the ridge of a roof, and often bowed at both ends so that its outline looks like a boat turned upside down. The sides are carved to look like wooden shingles or roof tiles, and at either end, in many of them, there is a bear, gripping the gable with its paws and putting its face against the end of the house. Nobody is quite sure what they are. The most likely answer is that they are houses for the dead, a stone version of the long timber hall, so that a man who had spent his life in one was laid under another. They appear suddenly in the 10th century. They are made for perhaps 3 or 4 generations, and then they stop, and they exist nowhere in Scandinavia itself. They are a purely Anglo-Danish invention, made by settlers who were no longer quite Danes and not yet quite English, and they have been sitting in country churchyards in the north of England for 1,000 years, being mistaken for broken masonry. There is a small object from a workshop in Denmark, a soapstone mold, that catches the same moment even more precisely. It is cut so that a smith could cast, from the same block, both crosses and Thor's hammers. He did not choose, he served the market. A customer came in and said what they wanted, and metal was poured, and everybody went away happy. That single mold contains the entire religious history of the settlement, and it fits in the palm of your hand. Why did the conversion go so easily? Partly because the settlers were not fighting a war of belief. They had come for land and profit, and their religion made no exclusive claims, so adding one more powerful god to the household was not a betrayal, it was prudence. Partly because they married local women, and children were raised by their mothers, and mothers here were Christian. Partly because the church was where the writing was, and writing was where the property records and the charters and the law were, so a man who wanted his sons to keep his fields had a practical reason to be inside the institution that recorded them. And partly, one suspects, because the ordinary business of a village makes theological disputes exhausting. Your neighbor's cow is in your barley either way. It should be said, because it is easily lost in the romance of ships and hogbacks, that there was one part of this economy which was straightforwardly terrible, and it does not fade with familiarity. The trade in people ran all through the age. The raids that opened this story were partly slave raids, and the markets at Dublin and Hedeby and further east dealt in human beings as a matter of ordinary commerce, and a household in the Danelaw might well have kept unfree servants who had been born free in a village 50 miles away. The English kept slaves too, before, during, and after. This is not a Scandinavian invention, but the arrival of a mobile, seaborne, well-organized trading network made the business more efficient, and efficiency in that trade is not a virtue. The church, to its credit, worked against it, slowly, over 2 centuries, and the practice faded in England within a generation or two after the Norman conquest. It belongs in the picture. A story about this age that leaves it out is a story that has been tidied. Alongside it stands the other side of the same coin, which is the position of women, and here the picture is genuinely more interesting than the usual account of either society. Scandinavian women could inherit property, could own land, could initiate a divorce, and ran the farm and its stores and its accounts. And there is a well-known image of the mistress of a household carrying the keys at her belt, which was not decoration, but authority. Women traveled with the settlement fleets. The oval brooches that Scandinavian women wore in pairs at the shoulders turn up in graves in England, and the isotope evidence from some of those burials shows women who grew up in Scandinavia and died in Britain. And a few of them appear in the story with real power, most spectacularly a queen at York in the mid-10th century, who seems to have been a formidable political operator and whom the English chroniclers clearly found alarming. English women of the same period were not without rights either, and the wills that survive show them holding and bequeathing substantial estates. But there is a case, made carefully by historians who count things, that the Danelaw counties preserved a slightly stronger tradition of female property holding than the rest of England for a long time afterwards, and that this, too, was one of the quiet inheritances of the settlement. Before we go back to the kings and their fortresses, let us spend a little while in a single Danelaw village, going round the year, because this is what the whole 3 centuries was actually for, and because there is nothing in the world more restful than someone else's calendar. Begin in the deep of winter, in January, in a valley in Lincolnshire, perhaps 30 years after the fields were shared out. The village is a dozen households strung along a low rise above the wet ground, each with a long low hall and a barn and a byre and a yard, and around them the arable and long strips, and beyond that the common pasture and the wood where the pigs are turned out in autumn. Nothing much is growing. The days are 8 hours long and gray at both ends. The work now is indoor work and maintenance work, and it is the season of mending. Harness is mended, and hurdles are woven from hazel, and armchairs and spade irons are taken to the smith, and ropes are twisted, and baskets made, and the women spin continuously, because a household needs a great deal of cloth, and thread does not spin itself. The food is what was preserved, salted and smoked meat from the November slaughter, hard cheese, dried peas, and beans. Stored barley and oats, whatever roots have kept in a clamp of sand and straw, and ale, always ale. The animals that were kept back for breeding are inside, at the end of the house or in the byre, eating hay that was cut in June, and every family in that valley knows to within a few days how long their hay will last, and does the arithmetic every morning without saying anything about it. Then, February, and the ground begins to open. The heavy work starts. Plowing in this country was done with an ox team, 2 or 4 or on the worst clay-ate beasts, and a plow with a coulter and a share and a mold board that turned the soil over into a ridge. And the fields ended up as long parallel corrugations that are still visible in the low evening light in 100 English pastures where the grass has never since been broken. Plowing is slow. A good team with a good man might do an acre in a day. Then harrowing, then sowing broadcast by hand from a seed lip slung at the hip, a swing of the arm for every 2 paces, the oldest gesture in agriculture, and then harrowing again to cover it, and then the birds and the boys sent out with slings and clappers to keep them off. Spring barley and oats go in now, the wheat and the rye went in back in the autumn and are already green and being weeded by hand. March and April are lambing and calving, which means nights without sleep, and the ewes are brought in close, and the losses are counted, and then in late spring comes the moment every farming society in the northern world has always dreaded, which is the hungry gap. The weeks when the stores from last year are nearly out, and this year's crops are still standing green in the field, and not one grain of it can be eaten yet. Everyone got thin in May. In June, the whole village stops everything and cuts the hay. Because hay is not a crop, hay is the difference between having animals next spring and not having them. And it must be cut and turned and dried and stacked in a window of dry weather that England does not reliably provide. Then, a short breath. Then, from late July into September, the harvest, which is the hardest and happiest work of the year, sickles and reaping hooks, the corn cut high and bound into sheaves, the sheaves stood in stooks to dry. The whole population in the fields, including the smith and the old and the children, and the last of it carted in and stacked, and then threshing on the barn floor with flails all through the autumn and winter, and winnowing in the doorway where the draught runs, throwing the grain up so the chaff blows away, over and over for months. In late September, the harvest ale, which everyone remembered. In October, the pigs go into the wood for the acorns and the beech mast, and the ewes go to the ram. And in November comes the month the English simply called Blood Month, when the animals that cannot be fed through the winter are killed and salted and smoked, and the whole village smells of wood smoke and brine and boiling fat for a fortnight, and the barrels are filled. And everybody eats better in that 1 month than in any other. Then the fires bank down, and the days shorten, and the spinning starts again, and midwinter arrives with its 12 days of feast, in which almost the only obligation is to stay warm and eat and listen to somebody tell a long story badly. That is the year. It went round like that, in that valley, for centuries. It went round like that before the ships came, and it went round like that afterwards, and the man doing the plowing in the year 910 may have had a Danish grandfather and a Norse name and a word for the stream at the bottom of the field that his English neighbors had adopted without noticing, and none of that changed the date of the hay cut by a single day. This is the part of history that never makes the chronicles, because chronicles record interruptions, and this is the thing that was interrupted. Kings came and went overhead like weather. Underneath, in the strips and the byres, the same 11 or 12 tasks came round in the same order, and the people doing them were the ones who quietly turned two peoples into one, not by any decision, but by needing each other at haymaking. Meanwhile, south and west of the treaty line, Alfred's children were doing something their father had prepared for but not attempted. They were taking the Danelaw back, and they were doing it not with a great battle, but with a spade. Alfred's son was Edward, called the Elder, and Alfred's daughter was Ethelfleda, who had been married as a young woman to the ruler of English Mercia in one of those alliances that hold two kingdoms together, and who, when her husband died, was not set aside as a widow but simply carried on ruling, and was called by the Mercians the Lady of the Mercians, and led armies in the field for 8 years. Between them, brother in the south and sister in the Midlands, they ran one of the most methodical campaigns of expansion in early medieval Europe, and the method was the burr. They did not chase the Danish armies, they advanced by building. A force would move up to a river crossing, 20 or 30 miles into contested ground, and stay there while a fortress was thrown up, ditch and bank and palisade, and a garrison installed, and then the whole countryside, within a day's march of that fort, was effectively administered from it, because the local farmers could see who could protect them. Then, the following season, they moved another 30 miles and did it again. Fortress by fortress, year by year, they walked the frontier northeast across England, and behind the frontier, the reclaimed districts were organized into shires with a fortified town at the center of each, which is why so many English counties are named after their county town, and why the shape of local government in the Midlands was set by a military engineering program of the early 900s. Ethelfleda built at Tamworth and Stafford and Warwick and Cherbury and Runcorn. Edward built at Hertford and Buckingham and Bedford and Towcester and Colchester and Stamford. When a Danish army came out to fight, they fought it, and generally won, but the winds were the punctuation, and the building was the sentence. And one by one the Danish jarls of the East Midlands did the arithmetic and submitted. because a lord in Northampton or Leicester could see quite clearly that he was now surrounded by English fortresses, that his own people were trading with them, and that resistance would cost him his land, while submission would probably let him keep it. That was the crucial offer, and it was made deliberately: submit and keep your estates, your customs, and your law. Not one of these districts was cleared of its Danish population. They changed allegiance, not inhabitants. Ethelflada's own record is remarkable and was systematically underplayed by later West Saxon writers who found a woman commanding armies difficult to file. She took Derby by storm, losing 4 of her own thanes inside the gates, which the chronicler notes with unusual sorrow. She took Leicester by negotiation. She was in contact with the leading men of York, who were preparing to accept her authority as well, when she died at Tamworth in the summer of 918, which is one of the great what-ifs of the period. Her daughter succeeded her briefly as the ruler of the Mercians, and was then quietly removed to Wessex by her uncle and disappears from the record, and Mercia's separate existence ended there. It is not a generous act, and it is a thoroughly typical one, and it completed the unification. By the time Edward the Elder died in 924, every Danish district south of the Humber had submitted, and the kings and lords of the north, English, Danish, Norse, and Scottish, had all at various points acknowledged his overlordship in one form or another. His son Athelstan then did the thing nobody had done. He took York. In 927, on the death of its Norse ruler, Athelstan marched north and expelled the claimant and took the city, and for the first time in history, a single king ruled all of what we now call England, from the Channel to the Tweed. He called himself King of the English, and then, on some of his charters, in a burst of enthusiasm his scribes clearly enjoyed, King of all Britain. He was a serious man, a great collector of relics, a founder of churches, a legislator, and the most connected monarch in Europe. His sisters married into the Frankish and German and Norwegian royal houses. Foreign princes were fostered at his court, and he sent and received embassies from one end of Christendom to the other. And in 937, everybody who resented him formed a coalition and came for him at once. It was a genuinely alarming alliance. The Norse king of Dublin, the king of the Scots, and the king of the Britons of Strathclyde, combining across the Irish Sea to break the new English kingdom apart and restore the old arrangement in which the North was independent and Norse. The armies met at a place the sources call Brunanburh, and nobody has ever been able to agree where it was. The strongest modern candidate is on the Wirral. But it has been placed in a dozen counties, and the argument is not over. What is not in doubt is the scale of it and the result. It was a slaughter that appalled even the people who won. The chronicler broke out of his usual dry prose into a long alliterative poem, which is one of the earliest great war poems in English. And it says that never yet in this island was there greater slaughter of people felled by the sword's edges, and it lists 5 young kings and 7 earls left on the field, and describes the Dublin king fleeing to his ship with a handful of survivors. And it ends by saying that the dark raven and the eagle and the wolf in the wood had the corpses to themselves. Athelstan won completely. The coalition never reformed. And the English kingdom, which had been an idea in Alfred's head 60 years earlier and a piece of political convenience for 2 generations after that, became on that day a fact that its neighbors had tested and could not break. York, however, was not quite finished being a Viking city. Athelstan died young, in 939, and the moment he was gone, the Northerners invited the Dublin Norse back, and for the next 15 years, the Kingdom of York changed hands with a regularity that is hard to follow and rather charming in its stubbornness. The city would accept an English king, then throw him out for a Norse one, then be reconquered, then rebel again. And the Archbishop of York spent those years performing feats of political flexibility that would embarrass a modern diplomat. The last of the Norse kings of York was a magnificent character called Eric, whose nickname in the later sagas was Bloodaxe, and whose career reads like a warning about family politics, son of the first king to unite Norway. He is said to have secured his own succession there by removing several of his brothers, was driven out by another one, arrived in Britain with a fleet and a reputation, ruled at York twice, and was finally expelled and killed in 954 in an ambush on a bleak crossing of the Pennines at a place called Stainmore, where a stone stood for centuries afterwards that local people called Ray Cross. With his death, the independent kingdom of York ended, and the whole of England was permanently one kingdom, and the first Viking age in Britain closed. What followed was about 40 years of peace and prosperity, presided over most notably by a king remembered as Edgar the Peaceable, in which the monasteries were refounded and reformed. The coinage was standardized across the whole country, with a system of periodic recall and reminting that was the most sophisticated in Europe, and the shires and hundreds and courts settled into the shape they would keep, in some cases, for 900 years. Edgar's reign is one of those quiet, good stretches that historians find hard to write about because so little goes wrong. His most famous piece of theater was at Chester, where he is said to have been rowed on the River Dee by 6 or 8 other kings of Britain, taking the steering oar himself, which is either a magnificent statement of overlordship or an early example of the political photo opportunity, and probably both. Then it went wrong again, in a way that people at the time understood as an unfinished story returning. In the last decade of the 10th century, Scandinavian fleets came back to England, and this time they were not war bands of a few hundred, but royal expeditions, launched by kings who now ruled unified nation-states in Denmark and Norway, with standing forces and professional soldiers. At a moment when the English throne was occupied by Ethelred, who ruled for 38 years and is remembered by a nickname that has been mistranslated ever since. He was called the Unready, but the original word is unrayed, which means ill-advised or no counsel, and it was a pun on his own name, which meant noble counsel. So the joke was that noble counsel had no counsel at all, which is much sharper and much crueler than calling a man unready. In 991, a fleet came to Essex, and at Malden on the estuary a Danish force was met by the local ealdorman with the levy of the district, and the two sides faced each other across a tidal causeway. The Danes could not cross while it was held, and asked to be allowed over to fight fairly, and the English commander, in a decision that has been argued about for 1,000 years, let them. He then lost the battle and his life, and an unknown English poet wrote it up in a poem which survives and which contains the single most famous line of Anglo-Saxon verse, spoken by an old retainer standing over his lord's body as the shield wall collapses, saying, "That will must be the harder, courage the keener, spirit the greater, as our strength grows less." That line has been quoted in every English century since, and it was written about a defeat, which tells you something about the English and always has. What Ethelred's government did instead of fighting was pay, and this is where the word Danegeld enters the language. The first payment after Moulton was 10,000 pounds of silver, then 16,000, then 24,000, then 36,000, then in 10,012, 48,000 pounds of silver, which was an enormous fraction of the entire wealth of the country, raised by a land tax assessed on the shires and collected with a thoroughness that the English administrative machine, ironically, was uniquely well equipped to manage. The English coinage of this period turns up in Scandinavian hoards in staggering quantities. There is more late Anglo-Saxon silver in the ground in Sweden than in England, and the effect was exactly what you would expect. Paying a fleet to go away is a purchase of one winter, financed by advertising your wealth to every fleet that has not yet come. In the middle of this, Ethelred did something worse. In 1002, on the feast of St. Brice in November, he ordered the killing of Danish men living in England, on the grounds that they were plotting against him. How widely this was carried out is unclear, and it certainly did not touch the settled Danelaw, where such an order would have been meaningless and suicidal. It seems to have fallen on recent arrivals in the south. In Oxford, a group took refuge in a church, and the townspeople burned it, and we know this because the king himself later paid for the church's rebuilding, and the charter describing why survives, written in his own administration's careful Latin, describing an atrocity as a regrettable necessity. It was the sort of act that solves nothing and hardens everything. Within a decade, the King of Denmark, Svein Forkbeard, was not raiding England, but conquering it. By the end of 1013, the North had accepted him, then the Midlands, then the West, then London, and Ethelred fled overseas to Normandy, where his wife's family ruled. A detail that will matter enormously in 50 years' time. Svein was King of England for 5 weeks and then died suddenly at Gainsborough in February, and the English, with a sort of weary optimism, invited Ethelred back on condition that he governed better than before, which is the earliest surviving example in English history of a formal negotiated agreement between a king and his subjects about the terms of his rule. He did not govern better than before, and when he died in 1016, the war passed to his son, a young man called Edmund, who was given the nickname Ironside and earned it entirely. In a single year, Edmund raised armies 5 times, fought 5 battles, relieved London, and pushed Svein's son Nut back across half of England, and it is one of the great furious campaigns of the age. And then he lost at Essendon in Essex, largely because one of his own great earls changed sides in the middle of the battle, which was that earl's specialist subject. The 2 young kings met on an island in the Severn and divided the kingdom between them, Edmund taking Wessex and Nut everything north of the Thames, and a few weeks later Edmund died at about 23, and Nut took it all. What nobody expected was that he would then be one of the best kings England had had. Canute ruled for 19 years, and he ruled well. He began, it must be said, in the traditional manner, by removing a short list of English noblemen he could not trust, and by taking a large final payment from the country to pay off his fleet. But then he sent the fleet home, kept only a small permanent force, married Ethelred's widow, kept the English administrative system entirely intact, issued law codes in English that were mostly a restatement of Edgar's, appointed Englishmen and Danes side by side as his earls, gave enormous gifts to English churches, made a pilgrimage to Rome where he attended an imperial coronation, and used the occasion to negotiate lower tolls for English and Danish merchants crossing the Alps, and wrote home to his people a letter which survives, explaining what he had achieved on their behalf. He also ruled Denmark, and for a period Norway and part of Sweden, so that for about a decade the North Sea was an English and Scandinavian lake with one man at the center of it. And English priests were being sent out to organize the church in Denmark, and English coin design was being copied in Scandinavian mints. It is the closest Britain has ever come to being the metropolitan center of a northern empire, and it lasted less than a generation, and it has almost no place in the popular memory of English history at all. The one thing everybody does remember about Nut is the story about the tide, and it is worth putting right because it has been told backwards for centuries. In the version everyone half knows, a vain king sets his throne on the beach and orders the sea to stop and gets his feet wet and is a fool. In the original telling, written down a century later, the king is not the fool. His courtiers are. They have been flattering him, telling him that everything in the world is subject to his command, and he is sick of it. So he has the chair carried down to the water at the turn of the tide, and sits in it and orders the sea to come no further, and the sea, naturally, does not listen. And it soaks his feet and his robes. And he stands up in front of the whole court and says that the power of kings is empty and worthless, and that no one deserves the name of king but the one whose will heaven and earth and sea obey. And then, in the story, he takes off his golden crown and never wears it again, and hangs it on a crucifix. It is a piece of moral theater performed by a Danish conqueror to instruct English courtiers, and it has been remembered as a joke at his expense, which is a fine example of how history rewards the man who makes the memorable gesture and then loses control of the caption. His sons were nothing like him, and both were dead within 7 years of their father, and the English throne went back to the old West Saxon line in the person of Ethelred's son Edward, who had spent his entire childhood and youth in exile in Normandy and came back speaking French with Norman friends. Which brings us at last to the year the Viking Age in Britain ended, and to the fact that it ended twice in 3 weeks. When Edward died childless in January of 1066, 3 men claimed England. Harold Godwinson, the greatest earl in the country, was chosen by the English council and crowned at once. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed a promise. And Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, claimed it on the basis of an old agreement between his predecessor and Canut's son, which is to say on the basis of the Viking Age itself. Hardrada was the last of the great sea kings and had the most spectacular curriculum vitae in Europe. Exiled at 15 after a lost battle, he had gone east down the Russian rivers, served the Prince of Kiev, then gone on to Constantinople and served 10 years in the Varangian Guard, the Emperor's Scandinavian household troops campaigning in Sicily and Bulgaria and the Holy Land, and had come home in middle age with a fortune and taken the throne of Norway. He landed in Yorkshire in September of 1066 with perhaps 300 ships, beat the northern earls at Fulford, and took the surrender of York, and then went out to a river crossing east of the city called Stamford Bridge to receive hostages from the district. It was a warm day, They had left their mail shirts at the ships, and Harold of England, who had been waiting all summer on the south coast for a Norman invasion, marched his household troops from London to Yorkshire, about 185 miles, in 4 days, and arrived at Stamford Bridge before anyone knew he had left the south. What followed was a long day's fighting on both banks of the river, and it ended with Harold Hardrada dead with an arrow in his throat, and the Norwegian army so completely destroyed that of the 300 ships that had come, 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. It was the most decisive English victory over a Scandinavian invasion in 3 centuries, and it is remembered. When it is remembered at all, as a footnote, because 3 days later the wind changed in the Channel and William of Normandy landed at Pevensey, and Harold turned his exhausted army round and marched it back south, and on the 14th of October he was killed on a hill near Hastings. There is one last irony to lay down here, and then we can put the kings away for good. The Normans who conquered England in 1066 and who replaced its aristocracy and its bishops and its language of government, and whose descendants would rule for centuries, were themselves Vikings. Their duchy existed because a Norse war band under a leader called Rollo had been granted the lower Seine by a Frankish king in the year 911. On precisely the same terms and for precisely the same reasons that English kings had made grants to Danish settlers, and the name Normandy simply means the land of the Northmen. In 150 years, they had become French-speaking Christian feudal lords with cavalry and stone castles so thoroughly assimilated that they no longer thought of themselves as Scandinavian at all. So the last invasion of the Viking Age was defeated at a river crossing in Yorkshire, and the country was then conquered 3 weeks later by the great-great-great-grandchildren of Vikings who had simply taken a different route and arrived speaking French. History, again, arranged that and said nothing about it. Which leaves the last and best part of the story, the part that is not in a chronicle or a churchyard, but in your own mouth. Because the Vikings lost the political war in Britain, every kingdom they founded here was eventually absorbed. Every dynasty they planted died out. Their gods were abandoned within 3 generations, their ships rotted, their halls burned or fell in, their laws were folded into English law and forgotten. And yet they left behind something that no conqueror in British history has matched, which is that they permanently rebuilt the English language from the inside, so quietly and so thoroughly that for 800 years nobody noticed it had happened. Here is the shape of the problem. Old English and Old Norse were cousins. They had split from a common ancestor perhaps 5 or 6 centuries earlier, which means that in the 9th century they were roughly as far apart as, say, Dutch and German are now, or perhaps a little closer. A Yorkshire farmer and a Danish settler standing in the same field could probably make themselves understood on the subject of cattle and weather within a few minutes, with some pointing, and could hold a full conversation within a few weeks. The word for house was similar. The word for man, wife, land, ox, cow, sheep, winter, summer, dead, God, all similar, but the endings were different. Both languages were heavily inflected, meaning the ending of a word told you its job in the sentence, and it was exactly those small, unstressed endings, the last syllable, the part that gets swallowed, where the 2 languages diverged most. So imagine what happens across 2 or 3 generations in a mixed village. You are understood perfectly on your nouns and your verbs, and hopelessly on your grammatical endings. The efficient thing to do, and people are relentlessly efficient about speech, is to stop bothering with the endings and lean harder on word order and small helper words instead. Nobody decides this. It simply happens in thousands of daily transactions, in markets, in courts, in marriages, in a wide belt across the middle and north of England over about 150 years. And what comes out at the other end is a language that has shed most of its case endings, simplified its genders, hardened its word order, and taken on board a load of Norse vocabulary, which is to say, English, the vocabulary, is the part you can hear tonight. Norse words in English are not exotic imports sitting in the dictionary with dust on them. They are the most ordinary words there are, the ones you use before breakfast without noticing. Take, give, get, want, call, cast, cut. Die, drag, drown, lift, raise, scare, seam, sprint, trust, thrive, guess, gasp, crawl, egg, sky, skin, skirt, skull, sister, husband, knife, leg, neck, root, bag, cake, dirt, fellow, freckle, gap, gift, kid, link, loan, race, reindeer, rug, score, seat, slaughter, snare, stake, thrift, window, wing, anger, all, bond, both, same, ill, odd, ugly, weak, lose, low, meek, muggy, rotten, sly, tight, wrong, flat, happy, comes from a Norse root, and so does hap and haphazard and perhaps. Berserk is Norse, and so is ransack, and so is the whole idea of a husband, whose original meaning was simply a householder, a man bound to a house, and which had nothing at all to do with marriage until English decided it did. Some of these arrivals are so intimate it is startling. The word for the sky replaced the native word, which was heaven, and pushed heaven upstairs into religion. The word for skin replaced the native hide, which retreated to animals. The word for a window, which literally meant wind eye in Norse, replaced the native eye hole. And the word for an egg replaced the native eye, and there is a lovely piece of evidence for that fight. Because an English printer in 1490, 700 years after the settlement, complained in a preface that he did not know which word to use in his books, since a merchant asking a woman in Kent for eggs was told she understood no French, while northern readers would not accept iron. Two words for the same thing, still contending. At the very moment printing arrived to freeze the language, the Norse one won, and now nobody has ever heard of the other. Then there are the pairs, and the pairs are the most fun, because when two cousin languages meet you, often end up keeping both words and giving them slightly different jobs, and English has done this so often that half its supposed richness of nuance is really just a record of a merger. Shirt is English, skirt is the same original word arriving in Norse form, and now they are two garments. Shatter and scatter, ditch and dyke, church and kirk, the latter surviving in the north and in Scotland, and in 1,000 place names, whole and hail, no and nay, from and fro, as in to and fro, which is a fossil, craft and skill, wish and want, hide and skin, sick and ill, rear and raise, even the sounds tell you the origin. If an English word begins with the sound skick, it is very likely to be Norse, because in Old English that combination had softened to a sh sound centuries earlier, while in Norse it stayed hard. So ship and shirt and shall and shell are English, and skiff and skirt and skill and skull came off a boat. The same is true of a hard G or K before a front vowel, which gives us get and give and kid and gift, where a pure English development would have produced a softer sound. You can practically date a word by putting it in your mouth. And there is one further category, the ghostly one, where the Norse word did not replace the English word but changed its meaning, so that the English word survived wearing borrowed clothes. Dream in Old English meant joy or music or revelry, and it came to mean the thing you see when asleep because the Norse cousin word meant that. Bread meant a fragment or a morsel. It took over the whole loaf under Norse influence, while the native word for bread, laugh, shrank into loaf. Plow, gift, home, dwell, earl, all shifted their sense under pressure from a near identical neighbor. Those are the hardest borrowings to see, and there are more of them than anyone can count, and they mean that the influence of the settlement runs deeper into the language than a word list can show. Now, borrowing words is common. Every language does it, constantly, from every neighbor it meets. English took thousands of words from French after 1066. Far more words than it ever took from Norse, and tens of thousands from Latin. But there is a difference between borrowing vocabulary and borrowing grammar, and grammar is the part languages almost never give up, and this is where the Scandinavian settlement stands alone in the history of English. Consider the words they, them, and their. These are not decorative. They are among the most frequent words in the language, structural bolts holding sentences together, and they are Norse. Old English had its own perfectly serviceable set, beginning with an H sound, and those forms had a fatal flaw, which was that they had become nearly indistinguishable from the words for he and him and her. In a mixed language region where clarity was already under strain, the incoming Norse forms with their clear initial sound were simply better tools, and they were adopted and they spread. And you can watch it happen on the map, because the earliest texts to use them are northern, and the southern texts hold out for centuries, and there is a period when a writer in the Midlands uses the Norse form for the subject and the Old English form for the object in the same sentence, mixing the two sets, which is exactly the sort of untidy compromise that real language change looks like. From the inside. By the 15th century, the Norse forms have won everywhere. Every time you say they, you are using a word that arrived here in a longship. The same is true of the little word are. The present plural of the verb to be in Old English was synden or beoth, and it is the Norse form that took over, so that the most common verb in English, in its most common form, carries the settlement in it. And the same is true of a habit so small you have never once thought about it, which is that English lets you drop the word that out of a sentence. You can say, the man I saw, rather than the man that I saw. That construction is essentially unknown in the other West Germanic languages, and it appears in English in the same period and the same region. And it is very probably Norse. So are the phrasal verbs, the vast, unruly system by which English attaches a preposition to a verb and changes its meaning entirely, so that you can take up, take on, take in, take out, take over, take after, take against, and take to, all of them different, and none of them guessable from the parts. Norse loved doing that. English learned it. Then there is the great disappearing act, the loss of the endings. Old English was a language of cases and genders, with definite articles that changed shape depending on the grammatical role and gender of the noun, 5 cases, 3 genders, and a sort of table of endings that makes modern students of German feel fortunate. Modern English has almost none of it. We have a possessive apostrophe and a plural s and a handful of pronoun forms, and that is essentially it. English shed a whole grammatical system, and it shed it earliest and fastest in exactly the areas of Scandinavian settlement, and only much later in the South and West. Now, some of that simplification was happening anyway, for internal reasons in all the Germanic languages. And honest scholars are careful not to hang everything on the Danes. But the timing and the geography are hard to argue with, and the mechanism is entirely plausible. Two mutually half-comprehensible languages in daily contact, where the endings are precisely the parts that do not match, produce a generation of speakers who simply stop relying on them. And when the endings go, word order has to do the work instead, which is why English is so strict about subject before verb before object, and why moving a word in an English sentence changes the meaning, while in Latin it barely changes the emphasis. Some linguists have gone further and argued that English should properly be classified as a North Germanic language, a Scandinavian language with a huge English vocabulary rather than the other way round. That is a minority view, and most specialists reject it, but the fact that it can be argued at all by serious people tells you the depth of what happened in those valleys. And there is a final piece of evidence that is not written down anywhere, but which you can still hear. The dialects of the old Danelaw kept Norse words in everyday speech long after Standard English had dropped them, and in many places they keep them still. In Yorkshire and Cumbria and Lincolnshire, within living memory and often today, a stream is a beck, a waterfall is a force, a hill is a fell, a ravine is a gill, a lane is a garth or a snicket, a small barn is a lath, a child is a bairn. To throw is to lake or to hoy, to cry is to greet, to tidy is to side away, tousled hair is tousled, to rummage is to fettle or to ferret, muck is muck. And a wet, miserable day is a mucky day. And every one of those words has a cousin sitting in a Norwegian or Danish dictionary. Shepherds in the northern hills counted their sheep for centuries in a numbering system whose origins are argued about. And the fell landscape itself is named in Norse from end to end: Scafell, Helvellyn, Ulswater, Langdale, Borrowdale, Buttermere, Thirlmere, Greasedale, Wasdale, Eskdale, Rothwaite, Seathwaite, Stonethwaite. A person walking in the English Lake District today is walking through a Norse map, reading Norse aloud off every signpost, generally under the impression that they are speaking English, which they are, which is the whole point. While we are pulling threads out of the language, we should deal with the word Viking itself, because it has caused a great deal of confusion. It was not a nationality. In Old Norse, a Viking was a person who went on a certain kind of expedition, and the expedition itself was called a Viking, so that a man went off on a Viking the way a man might go off on a voyage. And the great majority of Scandinavians in this period never went on one at all. Calling the whole population Vikings is a little like calling the whole population of a modern country pirates, because a few hundred of them once were. The English at the time did not generally use the word either. They said Danes, whether or not the people in question came from Denmark, or heathens, or the Northmen, or simply the host. The word Viking was pulled out of the sagas and popularized in English only in the 19th century, at exactly the same time as the horned helmet and the funeral ship and the whole splendid operatic apparatus that has been stuck to these people ever since. It is worth saying plainly because it colors everything. The raider with the horned helmet and the flowing hair roaring is a Victorian invention, and Victorian Britain invented him because it had a large navy, an interest in Norse literature, an empire it wanted to give a Nordic ancestry, and a taste for the sublime. The real people were shorter than us, immaculately groomed, obsessed with textiles, and mostly worried about hay. What actually preserved their inner world was not England, but Iceland. Iceland had been settled by Norse families during exactly this period, in the late 9th century, an empty island in the North Atlantic that had never held a human being before, and its settlers built a society with an assembly, the Althing, that met in the open air at a rift in the rock and which still exists as the national parliament today. And 2 and 3 centuries later, when Iceland was Christian and literate and cold and short of anything much to do in the winter, Icelanders wrote everything down. They wrote the sagas, which are prose narratives about the families and feuds of their own ancestors, hundreds of them, written in a plain, unsentimental style so modern that a reader coming to them from Victorian literature is genuinely startled. They wrote down the old poems about the gods. A scholar and politician called Snorri compiled a handbook of mythology to help young poets understand the old imagery, and that handbook is more or less the only reason anybody today knows the names of Odin's ravens or what happens at the end of the world. Almost everything popular culture believes about Norse religion comes at several removes. From Christian Icelanders writing about their great-great-grandparents' beliefs with a mixture of scholarly duty, national pride, and mild embarrassment. There is a strange symmetry in it. The English kept the language and lost the myths. The Icelanders kept the myths and lost nothing at all, having had nothing to lose. The physical evidence of the settlement in Britain is more modest than the legend requires and more moving because of it. There are very few Viking graves in England, partly because the settlers converted so quickly. There is a large burial ground at Repton in Derbyshire, where the great army wintered in a churchyard and cut a ditch straight through a royal Mercian mausoleum. And beside it a mound containing the disarticulated bones of a couple of hundred people, mostly young adult men, which may well be the gathered dead of the campaign. There are a handful of boat burials in the far north and the Isles. There are hoards, a great many hoards, silver, put in the ground in a frightening year by someone who never came back for it, which is the archaeologist's gain and somebody's ancient disaster. There are the hogbacks. There are the stone crosses. There is a small ivory chess set from the Isle of Lewis, made a little later, whose grim-faced kings and biting berserker rooks have become the visual shorthand for the whole age. And there is the genetic evidence, which has come a long way and which says, roughly, that in most of England, the Scandinavian contribution to the modern population is real but modest, a few percent, rising higher in specific pockets of the north and much higher in the far northern Isles, in Orkney and Shetland, which were not settled but effectively colonized, and which remained under Norwegian rule until the 15th century, and where the Old Norse language in its local form was still spoken by ordinary people into the 1700s. So the settlement of the Danelaw was not a replacement of a population. It was a few tens of thousands of people at most, arriving over a century into a country of perhaps 1.5 million, and their descendants married into everything around them until they were entirely indistinguishable, and the influence they left is out of all proportion to their number. That is worth sitting with, because it is the opposite of how invasions are usually imagined. They did not overwhelm England. They joined it at the top and in the middle and altered its speech from within, and vanished as a separate people so completely that a man in Lincolnshire in the 1200s with a Norse name and a Norse word for the stream at the bottom of his field would have been baffled to be told he was anything other than English. The institutional inheritance is quieter still, but it is there, and lawyers argue about it happily. The jury, the body of neighbors who decide a matter of fact, has roots that some historians trace into the sworn inquest of the Danelaw courts and others trace to Frankish practice, and the truth is probably tangled. The word by law survives on every notice board in the country. The writing survived until 1974 and lives on in the name of one modern county authority. The wapentake survived as an administrative unit into the 19th century. Trial by the oath of one's neighbors, the assembly held at a fixed mound at a fixed season, the fine paid in place of a feud, the idea that a free man's assent to a decision should be visible and audible. All of these ran on for centuries underneath the grander machinery of Norman and Plantagenet government, and some of them are still running wearing modern clothes. And now, before we let this go, let us go back to the island, because we left something there and it deserves an ending. The community of Lindisfarne did not die in 793. That is one of the quiet surprises of the whole story. They rebuilt, and they went on living on that tidal island for very nearly another century, through raid after raid, through the collapse of their kingdom, through the fall of York, until at last, in the 870s, with a Danish army sharing out the fields of Yorkshire and no king in Northumbria to appeal to, the brothers decided that the island was finished. And they did not leave empty-handed. They took up the coffin of Cuthbert, the shepherd's boy who had wanted nothing but the sky, and they carried it off the island across the wet sands at low tide, and then they walked. They walked for 7 years. The community wandered the north of England with that coffin and the relics inside it, and, we think, with their great gospel book, moving from one refuge to another, depending on whichever local lord would feed them, and there is even a tradition that they tried to take ship for Ireland and were turned back by a storm, and lost a jeweled book overboard and later found it washed up unharmed on the sand, which is the kind of story a community tells when it has come very close to losing everything and needs to believe the loss was refused. Eventually they settled at Chester-le-Street, and then, 100 years after that, they moved again to a high rock in a loop of the river where the ground was defensible, and there they stopped, and around that coffin grew a church, and around the church grew a monastery, and around the monastery grew a city, and the church was rebuilt after the Norman conquest into the most magnificent Romanesque cathedral in Britain, and it is still standing on that rock above that river tonight, with the bones of Cuthbert behind the high altar exactly where the wandering brothers finally put them down. Everything about that building is a consequence of 3 ships on a summer tide. And the gospel book survived. It is one of the most beautiful objects made by human hands in the first millennium, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the extraordinary thing is that we know the name of the man who made it, because a later hand wrote a note at the end recording that a bishop of Lindisfarne wrote this book, and a hermit made the covering of it, and an anchorite adorned it with gold and gems. The jeweled covering is long gone. That was the part worth stealing, and somebody stole it, either in a raid or in one of the many later dispersals. But the pages are there, all of them. The carpet pages with their interlaced birds, the great initials that unfold across a whole sheet, the 10,000 red dots. And between the lines of the Latin, in a small, cramped hand. Someone in the 10th century wrote a translation into English word by word, so that a reader who could no longer manage the Latin could follow, and that gloss is now one of the oldest surviving pieces of written English there is. So a book was made on a raided island, carried through a war by refugees on foot for 7 years, translated in the margins by a man whose own language was at that very moment being reshaped by the descendants of the people who had raided it, and it sits in a case in London tonight, and you can see the dots. Lindisfarne itself is still there and still an island twice a day. The causeway floods on the same schedule it flooded in 793. And every year a small number of visitors misjudge the tide and have to be pulled off the roof of their cars by a lifeboat crew, which suggests the sea has changed less than we have. The ruins on the island now are not the monastery the raiders saw. They are the remains of a Norman priory built later on the same holy ground, red sandstone, roofless, with one improbable rib of stone still arching over the nave where the ceiling used to be. Sheep graze it. The eider ducks are still on the water, still called Cuddy's ducks. If you stand on the shore there on a bright, still afternoon and look out to where the gray water meets the gray sky, you are looking at exactly what that brother with the driftwood was looking at. And there is nothing on the horizon at all. And that is the deepest thing this story has to offer, I think. And it is a comfortable thing rather than a sad one. Everybody in it was certain that they were living at the end of the world. The monks were certain of it and wrote it down in those words. Alcuin was certain of it. Alfred in the marsh in January must have been about as certain as a man can be. The Northumbrians at York, the East Anglians, the people of Wiltshire who submitted because no help was coming, all of them experienced this as the end of everything they knew, and in a real sense, they were right, because the world they had did not come back. And yet what actually happened over the 3 centuries this story covers was not an ending. It was a mixing. The raiders became farmers. The farmers became neighbors. The neighbors intermarried and argued about cattle and went to the same courts and buried their dead under the same stones with bears on the ends and struck coins with each other's saints on them. And their children spoke a single language that was neither of the 2 languages their grandparents had brought to the field. The kingdom that came out of it was larger and better organized and more literate than anything that existed before the ships came. The country got its towns, its counties, its coinage, its law courts, its first written history, and a great deal of its everyday speech out of the worst 200 years it had ever had. Nobody planned that. Nobody at the time would have believed it. And it is not a tidy moral, because the monks who were killed were still killed, and the people who were carried off in the bottom of a boat were still carried off, and no amount of interesting linguistic consequence makes that acceptable. But it is true all the same that the frightened world of 793 turned by small ordinary transactions repeated over 10 generations into the England of the year 1100, and that nobody in that later England could have told you which of their words came from which side. There is one last picture I want to leave you with, and it is not a battle or a treaty or a page of dots. It is the crossing itself, because nobody ever describes it, and it was the thing that made all the rest possible, and it is, I think, the most restful image in the whole story. Imagine the second night out from the coast of Jutland on a ship perhaps 24 meters long and 5 wide, with a crew of 30 or so in their gear and a few animals amidships. There are no cabins. There is no deck to go below. There is the open hull, the long oak planks curving up on either side, the sea running past close enough to touch, and a great woolen sail above, greased with tallow so that it holds the wind and sheds the rain, and it takes a woman something like a year of spinning and weaving to make a sail of that size, which is a fact that ought to be better known, because it means every one of these voyages rested on an enormous, invisible labor done by someone who never left the farm. There is no compass. There will not be one in northern Europe for another 300 years. So how do you cross open water and arrive where you meant to? You arrive by knowing things. You know that the sun rises and sets at a predictable bearing for the season, and you keep it on the correct shoulder. You know the height of the midday sun for your home latitude, and you sail west along it. So that navigation is less like plotting a course and more like walking along an invisible fence. You know the swell and the direction the long, steady rollers have been running for days, and you can feel through the hull when it changes. You know the clouds pile up differently over land and hold a faint, different color underneath. You know the birds. A gannet fishing means one thing. A puffin with a beakful of fish means it is going home to a burrow, and you should note which way it is flying. You know the color of the water and the smell of the water, which changes near a coast. You know that if you carry ravens in a cage and release one, it will either come back, meaning there is nothing out there, or fly off with purpose, meaning there is. You know if you are a really experienced steersman, the taste of the driftwood and the shape of the weed. And you know from the men who have done it before that this heading, held for so many days, brings you in somewhere along a coast you will recognize when you see it. So the night passes. 2 men bail, always, in shifts. Because a clinker hull with iron rivets and caulking of tarred animal hair and wool is never entirely dry and was never meant to be. The steersman leans on the side rudder, a broad oar blade shipped on the right rear quarter, which is why the right side of a boat is still called the starboard, the steerboard side, and why the other side is the port, the side you can safely lay against a quay. Everyone else sleeps where they can, wrapped in a greased woolen cloak, wedged between the sea chests they row from, with their feet against the frames and their heads on rolled cloth, and the whole hull working gently under them, flexing with the swell the way a basket flexes, because that is what it was built to do. It is cold. It is wet. It is loud in a rhythmic way that becomes, after a few hours, indistinguishable from silence. There is a smell of tar and wet wool and salt and sheep. And above them, with no cloud and no light anywhere on earth to compete with it, the whole sky is out, every star of it, turning slowly around the fixed one in the north that everybody on board can find without thinking. And the mast-top is drawing slow circles among them. That is what the Viking Age actually consisted of for most of the men who took part in it, not the shield wall. Long, cold, boring nights, going somewhere, held on course by ancestral knowledge and a great deal of patience, while the sail their mother wove pulled quietly overhead. Whatever else they were, and they were often terrible, they were also that. And in the morning there is a low gray line on the horizon that was not there at dusk, and someone stands up on a sea chest and points, and the steersman leans, and the whole ship turns very slightly, and the crossing is done. It is worth remembering, too, that most of those ships were not going raiding. The overwhelming majority of voyages in this period were trading voyages, cargo hulls broader and deeper than the sleek warships, carrying furs down from the north and iron and soapstone and antler and dried fish and grain and cloth and honey and wax, coming into Jorvik and Dublin and London and Hedeby and Kiev, unloading, taking on wool and lead and silver and whatever else would sell, and going home. For every fleet that shows up in a chronicle because it burned something, there were 100 sailings that show up nowhere at all, because they simply arrived, sold their cargo, paid the reeve his duty, and left, which is exactly what those first 3 ships at Portland were assumed to be doing all those pages ago. By an official who rode down to the beach with a wax tablet and no expectation of trouble. The chronicles record the exceptions. The ordinary business of the sea went on underneath, year after year, unrecorded, in the way that ordinary business always does. And when the raiding stopped, the trading did not. And the North Sea, which had been a barrier for the whole of Roman and early English history, was permanently a road afterwards, and it has never stopped being one since. So let us set it all down gently, the way the brothers set down the coffin at last. 300 years. It begins with a reeve riding down to a beach in Dorset, expecting to collect a duty on cargo. And it ends with a Norwegian king dying at a river crossing in Yorkshire on a hot September afternoon with his mail shirt still lying at the ships. Between those 2 moments, an island of quarreling kingdoms is broken apart, and a fugitive king hides in a marsh in January, and a treaty draws a line up a river and along a Roman road. And men who came to strip the altars end up plowing the fields and minting coins with saints on them and carving their old wolf god onto Christian crosses, and their grandchildren are English and know no other home. Nothing about that was intended by anybody. Every single person involved was doing something short-term. The chieftain wanted silver for the winter and a name that would carry. The king wanted one quiet year and then another. The farmer wanted his hay in before the rain. And the accumulated result of all those small local decisions made by people who could see no further ahead than any of us can was a unified kingdom, a network of towns that are still towns, a county map that lasted 1,000 years, a legal habit of neighbors judging neighbors, and a language that half the world now speaks, carrying in its most ordinary words the vocabulary of farmers from the top of Europe. You have used their words tonight. If you were awake enough at the beginning to hear it, you have used dozens of them. Sky, window, take, give, want, get, both, same, they, them, there, are. Every one of those crossed the North Sea in an open boat with a woolen sail, and settled in a valley in the north of England, and worked its way so far into the middle of the language that it is now impossible to speak a sentence of English without them. That is a stranger kind of conquest than any of them could have imagined, and none of them ever knew they had achieved it. History does not disappear. It just becomes the ground beneath our feet, and the words in our mouths, and the name on the sign at the edge of a village that everyone drives past without reading. Are you still awake? If you are, there is another long, quiet story waiting for you on the screen, and it will begin the moment this one ends, so you need not do anything at all. If this helped you rest, you might like the video or subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and only tomorrow when it costs you nothing. And if you have been lying awake with me all this way, leave your location and your local time in the comments so that the next person scrolling through at 3 a.m. knows they are not the only one. Now let it all go. Let the ships go out on the tide and be gone. Let the marsh be quiet, and the causeway flood over, and the fires bank down to a red heart under a foot of turf. There is nothing left in this day that requires you, and nothing in this story that needs your worry, because all of it is finished. And it turned out better than anyone standing on that beach could possibly have believed. Let your shoulders drop one more inch. Let your breath get slower and longer, very slowly, very slowly, very slowly. Close your eyes. Good night and sweet dreams.